Good evening, and welcome back. What if the story of the world's longest-lasting civilization began not with grand declarations or mighty armies, but with the quiet, steady gift of a river that flooded each year and left behind rich black soil? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere special tonight, drop your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy reading where everyone is settling in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The land we now call Egypt stretches along the Nile, a narrow ribbon of green cutting through harsh desert on either side. For thousands of years before any written records, small groups of people had lived beside this river, planting crops in the soil left behind after the annual floodwaters receded. They used simple tools made of stone and wood. They fished with nets and spears. They buried their dead with care, placing a few useful items beside them. Life moved slowly, season by season, guided by the river's rhythm. Over time, these scattered communities grew larger. In the south, known later as Upper Egypt, the valley was narrower and the land more rugged. In the north, called Lower Egypt, the river spread out into a wide, fertile delta that reached toward the sea. The two regions developed their own local leaders and their own ways of doing things. They even had different gods and different symbols. The south favoured the tall white crown and the vulture goddess Nekbet. The north preferred the red crown and the cobra goddess Wadjet. For a long while, the two areas remained separate, sometimes trading, sometimes clashing. Then, around 5,000 years ago, something important began to change. Leaders in the south started to bring more villages under their control. One ruler in particular stands out in the stories passed down through later generations. His name was Nama, though some records also call him Menez. He is shown on a famous carved stone slab, wearing first the white crown of the south and then the red crown of the north. Whether he conquered the delta through battle or through clever alliances, the result was the same. For the first time, one man ruled both regions as a single kingdom. This joining of the two lands marked the beginning of what historians later grouped into dynasties, or families of rulers. Nama's success allowed the new kingdom to grow stronger. He and those who followed him set up a capital at a place where Upper and Lower Egypt met, near the point where the valley opens into the delta. They called it Ineb Hedge, the White Walls, though it would soon become known as Memphis. From there, officials could direct work on irrigation canals, collect grain taxes, and keep records using an early form of writing. The early kings understood that their power rested on keeping the Nile's flood under control and making sure the people had enough food. They organized teams of workers to clear channels and build small dams. They also began to think of the ruler as more than just a powerful chief. He was seen as the one who kept order, the one who made sure the land stayed fertile. This idea would grow deeper in the centuries ahead. Writing developed quickly once the kingdom was united. Scribes used pictures and signs pressed into wet clay or painted on pottery. These early records mostly listed goods, counted cattle, and noted the height of each year's flood. Yet even these simple lists show a growing system of government. Officials travelled the country to collect taxes in grain and livestock. Others oversaw the building of tombs for the kings and their families. Religion played a central part in daily decisions. People believed the gods controlled the Nile, the sun, and the safety of the land. The king acted as the link between the human world and the divine. He performed ceremonies to keep the gods happy so the flood would come at the right time and bring enough silt to grow crops. Temples were still small in these early years, built of mud brick rather than stone, but they already served as important centres for the community. As the first two dynasties continued, the kings strengthened their hold on the country. They sent expeditions south into Nubia to bring back gold, ivory, and exotic woods. They traded with people along the Mediterranean coast for cedar logs from distant forests. These goods helped make the royal court richer and allowed skilled craftsmen to improve their work. Potters turned out finer vessels. Jewelers shaped beautiful beads and amulets. Stoneworkers learned to shape harder materials with greater care. Burial customs also grew more elaborate. Kings and high officials were no longer simply placed in pits in the desert sand. Instead, they built larger tombs made of mud brick, shaped like low platforms called mastabas. Inside these structures, rooms held food, clothing, furniture, and weapons for use in the next life. The body was treated with care so it would last. This concern for preserving the dead would later lead to even greater developments in mummification and tomb building. By the end of the Second Dynasty, the basic pattern of Egyptian civilization was already clear. A single ruler governed a long, narrow land. A growing class of scribes and officials helped run the country from the capital. Farmers worked the fields according to the river's schedule. Craftsmen supplied tools, pots, and ornaments. And everyone looked to the king as the one who maintained balance between the human world and the forces of nature. The stage was now set for something much larger. The next rulers would take the skills learned in these early centuries and turn them toward projects on a scale never seen before. Stone would replace mud brick. Royal tombs would rise higher and higher. The Old Kingdom was about to begin, and with it would come the first great age of pyramid building. Yet none of this happened suddenly. It grew step by step from the patient work of farmers who trusted the Nile, scribes who kept careful counts, and kings who understood that their strength came from keeping the two lands united and the river's gifts flowing year after year. The first kings and their capital. The rulers who followed the unification worked steadily to turn a newly joined land into a functioning state. The man often linked to the founding of the capital city was Hor-Ahar, sometimes identified in later accounts with the name Menes. He chose a location at the meeting point of the valley and the delta, a place the Egyptians called Ineb Hedge, meaning the white walls. Over time, this settlement grew into Memphis, a city that would serve as the political heart of the country for many centuries. Its position allowed officials to move easily between the southern valley and the northern delta, making it practical to oversee the entire kingdom. From Memphis, the kings directed the first systems of national administration. They divided the country into districts known as nomes, each with its own local governor who reported back to the central court. Every year, or every other year, the king and members of his court travelled through these districts in a ceremony called the Followers of Horus. During these tours they counted cattle, measured grain stores, and assessed the wealth of each area. The information gathered helped decide how much tax each region should contribute, usually in the form of grain, livestock, or labour. The collected goods went into royal storehouses in Memphis, where they could be redistributed when needed, especially in years when the Nile flood was lower than usual. Scribes played an essential role in keeping the system running. They used an improving system of writing that combined pictures and sound signs. These records were kept on clay tablets or on labels attached to jars and boxes. Most of the surviving examples list quantities of oil, cloth, or grain delivered to the palace. The ability to count and record accurately gave the kings greater control over resources than any earlier ruler had managed. Officials trained in these skills gradually formed a professional class that served the court year after year. The early kings also strengthened their connection to the divine. They presented themselves as the earthly representative of the god Horus, the falcon-headed protector of kingship. This idea helped justify their authority across both Upper and Lower Egypt. Royal ceremonies in Memphis included offerings at small temples built of mud, brick, and wood. One important temple honoured the god Ptah, who was closely linked to the city itself. The king's presence at these rituals reminded everyone that the ruler stood between the people and the forces that controlled the river and the sun. Trade routes expanded during these reigns. Expeditions travelled south into Nubia to obtain gold and hard stone for tools and ornaments. Other parties moved northeast toward the Mediterranean coast, returning with cedar wood from the forests of Lebanon. These materials improved construction and craftsmanship. Carpenters could now build stronger boats and finer furniture for the royal household. Stoneworkers practiced shaping larger blocks, preparing skills that would prove useful later. Burial practices continued to develop. The kings and their high officials constructed larger mastaba tombs near the capital at Saqqara, a plateau just west of Memphis. These rectangular structures of mud brick contained multiple rooms stocked with food, clothing, and everyday objects the deceased might need. Some tombs included small models of servants or workshops, an early hint of the belief that the next world mirrored life on Earth. The kings themselves were often buried at Abydos in the south, in underground chambers surrounded by smaller graves of servants and officials. This dual tradition reflected the need to honour both the new capital in the north and the older sacred sites in the south. Several kings of the First Dynasty left clear traces of their activities. Den, who ruled for several decades, organised military campaigns against groups in the eastern desert and improved irrigation works. He is shown on ivory labels wearing the double crown that combined the white and red symbols of the two lands. His reign appears to have been a time of relative stability, with steady agricultural output supporting a growing population. Later rulers such as Ka continued the pattern of careful record-keeping and regular tours of the provinces. As the First Dynasty drew to a close, the basic framework of government had taken shape. A central court at Memphis collected information, stored surplus food, and directed labour when large projects were needed. Local governors handled day-to-day affairs, but remained accountable to the king. The idea that the ruler maintained the balance of the land, an order later called Ma'at, was already becoming central to how Egyptians understood their world. The Second Dynasty brought new challenges and adjustments. Some rulers continued to favour Memphis, while others appear to have spent more time in the south. Peribsen chose a different divine association, linking himself with the god Seth rather than Horus. This shift may reflect regional tensions or a deliberate attempt to balance powers within the court. His inscriptions include one of the earliest complete sentences in Egyptian writing, speaking of the unification of the two lands under his care. Later in the dynasty, Khâsekhemoui worked to restore harmony after a period of unrest. His name means "the two powerful ones appear," suggesting a conscious effort to bring opposing forces together again. Khâsekhemoui oversaw building projects that used more stone in their construction. His tomb at Abydos included a large enclosure and shows increasing skill in organising workers. By the end of his reign, the country had passed through roughly 400 years since unification. The systems of taxation, record-keeping, and royal ritual were now well established. Memphis had grown from a planned settlement into a busy centre with palaces, administrative buildings, and workshops. The kings of these early centuries did not rule alone. They relied on a circle of advisors, many of them members of the royal family or trusted nobles. Women sometimes held important positions, managing estates or serving in temple roles. The Queen Mother, in particular, often held influence, especially when a young king came to the throne. This network of families helped maintain continuity from one reign to the next. Agriculture remained the foundation of everything. Farmers planted emmer wheat and barley after the floodwaters withdrew in the autumn. They used wooden ploughs pulled by oxen and harvested with flint sickles. Irrigation ditches carried water to fields farther from the river. In good years, the surplus supported craftsmen, scribes, and the royal court. In difficult years, the stored grain from Memphis helped prevent widespread hunger. The entire economy moved in rhythm with the Nile's annual cycle of flood, planting, and harvest. Craftsmen in the workshops near the capital produced goods for both daily use and royal display. Potters turned out storage jars with distinctive shapes that changed slightly with each generation, allowing later scholars to date layers of occupation. Jewelers worked with gold, carnelian, and turquoise to create necklaces and bracelets for the elite. Boat builders constructed vessels sturdy enough for long journeys along the river or even short trips along the coast. The population grew slowly but steadily. Villages along the Nile became more numerous, and Memphis itself housed several thousand people by the end of the Second Dynasty. Most residents lived in modest houses of sun-dried brick with flat roofs where families could sleep on warm nights. The streets were narrow and dusty, but the proximity to the river and the royal projects brought a steady flow of goods into the city. By the close of the Second Dynasty, the country had developed a clear sense of itself as one kingdom. The kings had created institutions that could outlast any single ruler. Writing, administration, and the ideology of kingship provided tools that the next generations would use to attempt far larger projects. The stage was quietly being prepared for the innovations in stone architecture that would define the following era. The transition happened gradually. No single event marked the end of the early dynastic period. Instead, the accumulated experience of managing a unified land, keeping records, organizing labor, and honoring the gods gave the rulers who followed the confidence to experiment with new materials and grander designs. Memphis remained the center from which these developments would spread. Its white walls overlooking the fertile fields and the great river that continued to shape every aspect of life in the kingdom. Dawn of the pyramid builders, the structures of the Second Dynasty settled into place, and Memphis continued to serve as the steady hub of government. A new line of rulers took charge around the start of what later generations would group together as the Third Dynasty. One king in particular, known as Djoser, or sometimes called Netureket in the records, stepped forward to lead the country. His time on the throne brought a quiet but lasting shift in how the kings expressed their power and how the people organized large efforts across the land. The focus turned more deliberately toward building projects that used stone in ways no one had tried before on such a scale. Djoser had grown up within the court traditions that had been refined over the previous centuries. He understood the importance of keeping the two lands united and the need to honor the gods who watched over the Nile. Like his predecessors, he relied on a circle of trusted officials to manage the daily affairs of taxation, irrigation, and trade. Yet he also looked for ways to leave a more permanent mark on the landscape. The mud brick mastabas of earlier kings had served their purpose well, but Djoser wanted something that would endure longer and stand higher. He turned to a man named Imhotep, who held positions as a priest, a healer, and an architect at the royal court. Imhotep had studied the older building methods and began to experiment with new materials and designs under the king's direction. The project they started together was placed on the western plateau at Saqqara, just a short distance from Memphis and overlooking the river valley. Work crews first cleared a large area and laid out a base that resembled the familiar rectangular shape of a mastaba. They used blocks of limestone quarried from nearby cliffs instead of the sun-dried bricks that had been common up to that point. This choice marked a clear step forward in construction techniques. Stone could be cut to precise sizes and fitted together more securely, allowing the structure to rise without the risk of crumbling under its own weight. Imhotep did not stop at a single flat-roofed platform. He directed the builders to add a second layer on top of the first, slightly smaller in size, and then another on top of that. The result was a series of steps that climbed upward in 6 distinct levels. When finished, the entire monument reached about 204 feet in height, making it the tallest building anyone in the region had ever seen. Around the base, they constructed a large enclosure wall with decorative panels that echoed the style of royal palaces. Inside the complex, smaller buildings and courtyards were laid out to serve the king's spirit in the afterlife, including spaces for rituals that the priests would continue long after Djoser's death. The construction itself required careful planning and a steady supply of workers. Teams of men travelled to the quarries during the months when the fields were underwater from the annual flood. They used copper tools and wooden levers to free the limestone blocks from the rock face. Oxen pulled sledges loaded with stone along prepared paths. At the building site, ramps of earth and rubble allowed the blocks to be dragged upward as each new level took shape. The entire effort drew on the organisational skills that had been developed in earlier reigns, when officials had learned to count grain, assign tasks, and move large groups of people for public works. Scribes kept detailed records of the materials arriving each day and the rations distributed to the labourers. Djoser's decision to build in stone reflected the growing confidence of the kingdom. The country was producing enough surplus food to free thousands of men from farm work for part of the year. The Nile continued to provide reliable floods, and the systems of canals and storage helped smooth out any minor variations in the water levels. This stability allowed the court to invest resources in a project that would serve both practical and symbolic purposes. The Step Pyramid was not only a tomb but also a visible statement that the king maintained order across the land and that the gods favoured his rule. Its shape, rising toward the sky in stages, may have reminded people of the way the sun climbed each morning, or the primeval mound that Egyptian stories described as the first dry ground to emerge from the waters of creation. Imhotep's role in the project went beyond simple design. Later traditions remembered him as a wise counselor who understood both the practical side of engineering and the religious requirements of royal burial. He oversaw the placement of underground chambers beneath the pyramid, where Djoser's body would rest, along with rooms filled with stone vessels, tools, and other items meant for use in the next world. The walls of these chambers were decorated with blue-green tiles that imitated the appearance of reed matting, a nod to the older building styles while using the new durable material. Everything was arranged so that the king's spirit could move freely between the burial place and the offering chapels above ground. News of the project spread along the river as boats carried supplies and workers back to their villages. Farmers who participated returned home with stories of the massive stones and the organized way the work proceeded. Artisans in the workshops near Memphis honed their skills cutting and polishing the limestone, passing on techniques that would be used in even larger projects later. The success of the Step Pyramid encouraged other high officials to build their own smaller tombs nearby in the same style, creating a necropolis that grew steadily around the main monument. During Djoser's reign, the kingdom also maintained its connections beyond the borders. Expeditions continued to move south into Nubia for gold and stone, while trading parties brought back timber and resins from the eastern Mediterranean. These goods helped support the building effort and enriched the court. The king himself appears in surviving reliefs, wearing the traditional crowns and performing ceremonies that linked him to the gods Horus and the sun. His name was inscribed on monuments up and down the Nile, reminding everyone of the unity he upheld. The Step Pyramid stood completed by the end of Djoser's time on the throne. It had taken roughly 20 years of steady labour, with the work progressing layer by layer as the king's reign advanced. When he died, the complex became the centre for ongoing rituals performed by priests who lived in nearby buildings. Offerings of bread, beer, and meat were brought daily to sustain the king's spirit. The structure itself proved so solid that it survived the passing of centuries. Its stone blocks fitted tightly enough to resist the desert winds and occasional rains. The innovation at Saqqara set a new standard for royal tombs. Later kings in the Third Dynasty followed the example, though none matched the size or ambition of Djoser's monument. The use of stone spread to other buildings as well, including temples and administrative structures in Memphis. Craftsmen refined their methods for quarrying and transporting larger blocks, and architects began to think about even taller and more complex designs. The quiet confidence that had built up through the early dynastic period now found expression in these permanent landmarks on the plateau. Throughout the countryside, the rhythm of life continued much as before. The Nile rose and fell each year, fields were planted and harvested, and taxes flowed into the royal storehouses. Yet the presence of the Step Pyramid changed the way people thought about their king and their place in the larger order. It stood as proof that coordinated effort could achieve something lasting and impressive. Children growing up near Saqqara would see the structure every day as they tended animals or carried water, absorbing the idea that their land was capable of great works under the guidance of a single ruler. As the Third Dynasty drew toward its close, the lessons learned from Djoser's project passed to the next family of kings. The Fourth Dynasty would take the Step Pyramid idea and push it further, smoothing the sides and aiming for even greater height. But the foundation had been laid at Saqqara. Imhotep's design showed that stone could be used not just for durability, but for creating shapes that reached toward the heavens. The Old Kingdom, with its focus on monumental architecture, had truly begun. The step pyramid also highlighted the growing specialization within Egyptian society. While farmers still formed the majority of the population, a class of skilled stoneworkers, surveyors, and overseers had become essential. These men worked under the direction of officials who reported directly to the court. Their knowledge would be refined and expanded in the reigns to come. The success of the project reinforced the belief that the king's role was to maintain balance, or ma'at, by directing the energies of the people toward works that honored the gods and benefited the land. In the years immediately after Djoser, smaller step pyramids appeared at other sites, showing that the idea had taken hold. Yet none rivaled the original in scale or in the care taken with its surrounding complex. The enclosure at Saqqara included spaces for the king to perform symbolic rituals in the afterlife, such as running a course that demonstrated his continued vigour. These details reflected the deep concern for ensuring that the ruler's spirit remained active and protective of the kingdom long after his earthly life ended. The transition from the early dynastic period to this new phase had happened without sudden upheaval. The same river, the same scribes, and the same traditions of kingship continued. What changed was the ambition and the material. Stone replaced brick, and the skyline of the western desert gained a permanent silhouette that would inspire awe for generations. Djoser and Imhotep had opened the door to an era where the kings would compete to build ever more impressive monuments, each one a testament to the stability and prosperity that the unified land could achieve. The step pyramid at Saqqara therefore served as a bridge between the simpler tombs of the past and the grand structures that would follow. It demonstrated that the kingdom's resources, when organized carefully, could produce works of lasting beauty and engineering skill. As the sun rose each morning over the Nile and cast its light on the stepped layers of limestone, the monument reminded everyone who saw it of the power that flowed from a single well-managed realm. The stage was now prepared for the next kings to take these innovations and create something even more remarkable on the plateau at Giza, the Great Pyramids of Giza. The success of the step pyramid at Saqqara encouraged the kings who followed to refine the techniques of stone construction even further. The fourth dynasty opened with Sneferu, a ruler who took the idea of a stepped structure and began smoothing its sides to create the first true pyramids with straight, sloping faces. He started one project at Maidum, where workers added layers and filled in the steps, but the design proved unstable, and the outer casing later collapsed in places. Undeterred, Sneferu moved north and built another pyramid at Dahshur that started with a steep angle, but had to be adjusted midway when cracks appeared in the structure. The result became known as the Bent Pyramid. Still determined to achieve a perfect form, he completed a third one nearby, the Red Pyramid, with gentler slopes and a solid core of limestone blocks. These experiments taught the court valuable lessons about weight distribution, foundation stability, and the angle needed to keep the monument standing for centuries. Sneferu's son Khufu inherited a kingdom that was producing ample surplus and had a workforce skilled in moving massive stones. He chose a new site on the Giza Plateau, a few miles north of Saqqara and still within easy reach of Memphis. The location offered a firm bedrock foundation and a clear view across the Nile Valley. Khufu directed his architects to design a pyramid that would surpass everything built before. The Great Pyramid, as it came to be called, rose in a series of carefully levelled courses of limestone. Each block averaged 2.5 tons, and the finished structure contained roughly 2,300,000 of them. When completed, it stood 481 feet tall, with sides that measured 756 feet at the base. The outer casing of fine white limestone from Tura quarries across the river gave it a smooth, gleaming surface that caught the sunlight. The organisation required to build the Great Pyramid showed how far the central government had advanced since the days of unification. Officials divided the labour into teams of 20 to 30 men, each group identified by names such as the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkaure. These teams competed with one another to see who could move the most stone in a day. During the 3 or 4 months when the Nile flooded the fields, farmers from villages up and down the valley came to Giza to work on the project. They received regular rations of bread, beer, onions, and fish from the royal storehouses. A small city of barracks and bakeries grew up beside the plateau to house and feed them. Archaeologists later found the remains of these workers' quarters, complete with medical facilities where broken bones were set and injuries treated. The men were not slaves but ordinary Egyptians performing a form of national service that brought honour to their families and ensured the king's eternal protection for the land. Surveyors used simple tools made of wood and rope to keep the base perfectly square and level. They aligned the sides with the cardinal points by observing the stars, particularly the constellation known as the Great Bear. Ramps of packed earth and rubble rose alongside the pyramid as it grew taller. Workers dragged the blocks up these ramps on wooden sledges, pouring water ahead of them to reduce friction. Once each level was finished, the ramp was raised for the next course. At the very top, a capstone of granite was placed, and then the casing stones were laid from the top down as the ramps were dismantled. The entire project took about 23 years, matching the length of Khufu's reign almost exactly. Scribes kept daily tallies of stones delivered, tools issued, and food distributed, records that helped later kings manage similar efforts. Khufu's pyramid was part of a larger complex. A mortuary temple stood against its eastern face where daily offerings would be made. A long covered causeway led down to a valley temple near the riverbank, where the king's body would have been received after crossing the Nile. Smaller pyramids for queens and rows of mastaba tombs for high officials surrounded the main structure, creating an entire city for the dead. One of Khufu's officials, a man named Hemiunu, probably oversaw much of the planning. His own tomb near the pyramid contained statues and inscriptions praising his role in the king's building projects. The scale of the work demonstrated the king's ability to command resources from every nome in the country without weakening the economy. After Khufu's death, his son Khafre took the throne and chose a site just south of his father's pyramid for his own monument. Khafre's pyramid was slightly smaller, but built on higher ground, so it appeared almost as tall. Its casing stones were preserved longer at the top, giving a sense of how the Great Pyramid once looked. At the base of Khafre's complex stood the Great Sphinx, carved from a natural outcrop of limestone left after quarrying for the pyramids. The statue combined the body of a lion with the head of the king wearing the royal headdress. It guarded the approach to the pyramid and symbolized the ruler's strength and wisdom. The Sphinx measured 240 feet long and 66 feet high, making it the largest sculpture in the kingdom at that time. Workers shaped it with copper chisels and stone pounders, then smoothed the surface and painted it in bright colours that have since faded. Khafre's reign continued the same administrative systems that had supported his father. The same teams of labourers returned year after year, now experienced and efficient. The royal workshops produced more tools and sledges, and the supply lines from distant quarries ran smoothly. Trade continued to bring in cedar from Lebanon for boats and incense for temple rituals. The court at Memphis remained the centre of decision-making, with officials travelling regularly to check on provincial affairs. Khafre's pyramid complex included an even larger valley temple, built of massive granite blocks transported from Aswan far to the south. These blocks were so precisely cut that they fitted together without mortar. The third major pyramid at Giza belonged to Menkaure, Khafre's son. His monument was smaller still, standing only 228 feet high, but it used high-quality granite for the lower 16 courses, giving it a distinctive appearance. Menkaure's reign was shorter, and the work on his pyramid may have been rushed toward the end. Even so, the complex followed the same pattern of mortuary temple, causeway, and valley temple. Smaller pyramids for queens completed the group. Together, the three structures at Giza formed a striking skyline visible for miles across the desert and the Green Valley. They represented the peak of the Old Kingdom's power and prosperity, a time when the central authority could mobilize tens of thousands of people for projects that served no immediate practical purpose beyond honoring the king and ensuring his place among the gods. The organization behind these pyramids relied on a well-developed bureaucracy. Viziers, or chief ministers, coordinated the efforts of departments that handled grain storage, labor recruitment, and tool production. Local governors in each nome selected workers and collected the necessary supplies, sending them north by boat during the flood season. At Giza itself, overseers assigned tasks according to skill level. Stonecutters quarried blocks, masons dressed them to exact measurements, and haulers moved them into place. Cooks prepared meals in huge bakeries that produced thousands of loaves each day. The system ran so efficiently that later records from the 5th dynasty mention similar projects on a smaller scale, showing that the knowledge had been passed down. Life at the construction site followed a steady routine. Workers rose before dawn, ate a simple breakfast, and laboured until midday when the sun grew too hot. They rested in the shade of the ramps, then continued until late afternoon. Evenings brought storytelling and music around campfires. Many left short inscriptions on the stones they moved, such as "This side up for Khufu," or the name of their team. These graffiti give a glimpse into the human side of the work. Families sometimes accompanied the men, living in the nearby settlement. Children played among the half-finished ramps while their parents laboured. The presence of bakeries, breweries, and even a hospital suggests a permanent community rather than a temporary camp. The Giza pyramids also reflected changing religious ideas. The kings of the 4th dynasty placed greater emphasis on the sun god Ra. The pyramid shape itself may have symbolized the rays of the sun slanting down to earth or the primeval mound of creation. Each king built a small temple dedicated to Ra near his pyramid. Priests performed rituals there to ensure the ruler's spirit would join the sun on its daily journey across the sky. This focus on solar worship grew stronger in the following reigns and influenced later temple architecture. By the time Menkaur's pyramid was finished, the Old Kingdom had reached its greatest extent of centralized power. Memphis thrived as a bustling city with palaces, workshops, and harbours. The royal family and high officials lived in comfortable houses with gardens and pools. Artisans produced fine statues, reliefs, and jewellery that filled the tombs. The surplus from agriculture supported all of this without strain. Yet the sheer size of the Giza projects had required every part of the administration to work at full capacity. Future kings would find it difficult to match this level of effort, and signs of change were already appearing on the horizon. The 3 pyramids stood as silent witnesses to the height of royal authority. Their alignment and proportions demonstrated advanced knowledge of mathematics and astronomy. Later visitors, even in ancient times, marvelled at the precision of the joints between casing stones, so tight that a knife blade could not fit between them. The monuments served their purpose for centuries, protecting the king's bodies and ensuring their eternal offerings. Although the outer casing was eventually stripped away for other buildings, the core structures endured, reminding every generation of the time when one land under one ruler could achieve what seemed impossible. The success at Giza also spread influence beyond Egypt's borders. News of the great works reached traders from the Mediterranean and Nubia. Some foreign craftsmen may have come to study the techniques. Expeditions continued to bring back materials, and the court maintained diplomatic ties with distant lands. Inside the country, the projects fostered a sense of shared purpose. Farmers who worked at Giza returned to their villages with new skills and stories that reinforced loyalty to the crown. The entire kingdom felt the benefits of stability and abundance. As the 4th dynasty drew to a close, the lessons of Giza would shape the smaller pyramids built by later kings. The techniques of quarrying, transporting, and assembling stone were now standard knowledge. Yet the sheer scale of Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaur's monuments marked a unique moment. Never again would the Old Kingdom concentrate so much labour on a single group of structures. The plateau at Giza had become the most visible symbol of Egypt's early greatness, a place where the river's gifts, human organisation, and royal ambition came together in stone that reached toward the sky. The transition to the 5th dynasty would bring new priorities. with more emphasis on sun temples and slightly smaller royal tombs. But the memory of the Giza pyramids remained strong in the minds of scribes and officials. They stood as proof that when the two lands worked together under a strong king, they could create wonders that outlasted the people who built them. The zenith of the Old Kingdom had been achieved, and its light would continue to guide the country even as challenges began to appear in the years ahead. Life in the Old Kingdom. With the Great Pyramids of Giza standing as enduring landmarks of royal achievement and the transition to the Fifth Dynasty underway, the daily existence of people across Egypt reflected the steady prosperity that had built up over generations. The Old Kingdom had reached a point where the systems of irrigation, taxation, and labour organisation allowed most families to live without constant fear of shortage. The Nile continued to deliver its annual flood with remarkable consistency, leaving behind fertile soil that supported large harvests. This reliability shaped everything from work schedules to family routines, creating a society where roles were clearly defined, and everyone contributed to the greater order maintained by the king in Memphis. At the highest level stood the pharaoh and his immediate family, who resided in the royal palace complex within the capital. The pharaoh rose early each day to perform rituals at a small temple attached to the palace, offering incense and reciting prayers to ensure the sun rose and the river flowed as it should. He met with advisors in shaded courtyards cooled by fountains and servants waving large fans made of ostrich feathers. His meals consisted of roasted duck or beef, fresh bread baked from finely ground emmer wheat, and fruits such as dates and figs brought from palace gardens. Clothing for the royal household used the softest white linen, woven from flax grown on royal estates. The pharaoh often wore a pleated kilt with a broad collar of gold and semi-precious stones, while queens and princesses appeared in long, fitted dresses that fell straight to the ankles, sometimes layered with sheer shawls. Servants attended to every need, from bathing with scented oils to preparing the royal barge for trips along the river. Children of the royal family received lessons in reading, writing, and statecraft from the most learned scribes, preparing them for future responsibilities. Directly supporting the pharaoh were the high officials and scribes who ran the government from offices in Memphis and travelled regularly to the provinces. These men lived in larger mud-brick homes with several rooms, small gardens, and storage areas for grain and household goods. Their daily work involved reviewing reports on crop yields, approving expeditions for stone or timber, and settling disputes between nomes. Scribes sat cross-legged on the floor, with papyrus rolls spread before them, using reed brushes dipped in ink made from soot and gum. They wore practical linen kilts that ended above the knee, often with a simple belt, and sandals of woven papyrus for walking the dusty streets. Their food was nourishing and varied within the limits of what the land provided. Thick loaves of bread, barley beer brewed in large jars, bowls of stewed vegetables including leeks, cucumbers, and lentils, and grilled fish caught fresh from the Nile. Families in this class valued education highly, teaching sons the art of writing so they could follow in their father's footsteps. Evenings often brought visits from colleagues, where conversations turned to matters of administration, while children played nearby with wooden toys or small balls. Craftsmen and artisans formed an important middle layer, clustered in workshops near the palace or temple complexes. Stone carvers, potters, jewellers, and carpenters produced the tools, vessels, and ornaments used throughout the kingdom. They worked in groups under the supervision of overseers, shaping limestone blocks with copper chisels or turning clay on simple wheels to create storage jars. These workers lived in compact villages of mud brick houses clustered around the workshops, each home consisting of 2 or 3 rooms opening onto a shared courtyard where families cooked and socialized. Men typically dressed in short linen loincloths or kilts for ease of movement during labor, while women wore straight linen tunics that reached the calves, sometimes adding a short cape for cooler evenings. Their meals centered on the staples of bread and beer, supplemented by onions and garlic eaten raw or cooked, fresh fish or occasionally wild fowl, and whatever fruits or honey could be obtained at local markets. Habits among artisans included passing skills directly to sons through long apprenticeships, with breaks taken at midday to rest in the shade and share simple meals. Many took quiet pride in their output, occasionally inscribing a personal mark on a finished piece before it left the workshop. The great majority of the population consisted of farmers and general labourers who lived in small villages strung along the river banks. Their homes were modest one, or two-room structures of sun-dried mud brick, with flat roofs that served as extra living space in the evening. During the flood months, when fields lay under water, many men left for temporary work on royal building projects or canal maintenance, returning with extra grain rations that supplemented their own stores. Back in the villages, the routine centred on the agricultural calendar. After the waters receded, men guided wooden ploughs pulled by oxen through the moist soil, while women and children scattered seed by hand. Harvest time brought the whole community together, cutting stalks with flint or copper sickles, threshing grain by driving animals over it, and winnowing the chaff in the breeze. Clothing here was the simplest and most practical. Men wore short kilts or wrapped loincloths of coarser linen, and women dressed in basic sleeveless tunics or long dresses of the same fabric, often dyed in soft earth tones from plant extracts. Food remained straightforward and plentiful in good years: round loaves of emmer bread baked in clay ovens, home-brewed barley beer, large quantities of onions and garlic, cucumbers, radishes, and whatever fish could be netted from irrigation ditches or the river itself. Meat from cattle or goats appeared only during festivals or after a successful hunt. Families rose with the sun, worked until the heat peaked, then rested and resumed in the late afternoon. Children helped with lighter tasks such as herding goats or carrying water jars, learning the rhythms of the land from their parents. Social habits across all classes emphasized family bonds and community cooperation. Marriages were usually arranged between families of similar standing, with the couple setting up household in the groom's village or near his workplace. Women managed the home, prepared food, wove linen on small looms, and raised children, sometimes assisting in temples or markets if their skills allowed. Men gathered in the evenings to discuss the day's events or plan the next planting, while music from simple flutes or drums accompanied storytelling about past kings or the gods who watched over the river. Religious observance was woven into daily life rather than set apart. Small household shrines held offerings of bread and beer, and people wore amulets of faience or stone for protection. Festivals marking the flood or the harvest brought villages together for shared meals and processions, reinforcing the sense of belonging to a larger kingdom under the Pharaoh's care. This layered society functioned smoothly because each group understood its place and the benefits it received. Farmers knew their labour fed the court and funded the temples, while officials recognized that fair tax collection kept the villagers content. Artisans supplied the tools that made farming and building possible, and the pharaoh's rituals were believed to guarantee the Nile's generosity. Housing everywhere used the abundant Nile mud, baked into bricks under the sun, providing cool interiors even in the hottest months. Furniture was minimal low stools, reed mats for sleeping, and wooden chests for clothing and valuables. Bathing occurred in the river or with water carried from it, and personal cleanliness was valued, with oils and perfumes made from local plants used by all who could afford them. As the Old Kingdom continued through the 5th and 6th dynasties, these patterns of daily life held steady, even as royal projects became somewhat smaller and more temples to the sun god appeared. Scribes still recorded every bushel of grain and every head of cattle. Artisans refined their techniques, producing finer jewellery and more delicate pottery for elite tombs. Farmers experimented with better ways to channel water into distant fields, increasing the amount of land under cultivation. The population grew slowly, supported by the reliable food supply, and villages expanded along the river without straining resources. Children born in this era grew up hearing stories of the great pyramids built by their grandparents' generation, absorbing the idea that coordinated effort under a strong ruler brought lasting good to the land. The habits of the time also included a quiet respect for tradition, Elders advised on planting dates or festival preparations, and young people learned by watching and helping. Trade within the kingdom moved goods from delta fisheries to valley granaries, with boats carrying jars of beer or bundles of linen up and down the Nile. Foreign contacts remained limited to expeditions for raw materials, so daily life stayed rooted in local resources and customs. The social classes rarely mixed beyond the necessities of work, yet everyone shared the same dependence on the river and the same hope for a good flood each year. In the later years of the Old Kingdom, this prosperous way of living began to feel the first subtle pressures as longer reigns and larger families at court demanded more from the storehouses. Yet for most Egyptians, the daily round of planting, crafting, recording, and ruling continued without interruption. The linen they wore, the bread they ate, and the routines they followed had become the quiet foundation of a civilization that had already lasted for centuries. The era's stability allowed people to focus on their immediate tasks and trust that the systems in place would see them through another season. This grounded existence, far from the grand monuments, was what sustained the kingdom through its golden age and prepared it for the changes that lay ahead. Signs of strain and collapsias, the later kings of the 6th dynasty continued the patterns established by their predecessors. One ruler stood out for the sheer length of his time on the throne. Pepi II came to power as a young boy, probably around 6 years old, and his reign stretched across more than 9 decades. He inherited a kingdom that still functioned under the same administrative framework that had served the earlier pyramid builders, with officials in Memphis collecting reports from the provinces and directing resources where they were needed most. In his early years, Pepi II followed tradition closely, sending expeditions south into Nubia to secure gold and other materials, and maintaining the flow of cedar wood from the Mediterranean coast for temple repairs and boat construction. Records from his reign show that the court continued to perform the regular ceremonies honouring the gods and the Nile, and the king issued decrees that confirmed the rights of local temples to their lands and offerings. Over time, however, the long duration of his rule began to create new pressures within the system. As Pepi II grew older, the daily decisions of government fell more heavily on his viziers and the growing number of provincial governors known as nomarchs. These governors had always managed local affairs, but now they started to build larger tombs in their own districts rather than near the royal cemeteries at Saqqara or Abydos. Their inscriptions praised their own achievements in managing irrigation works, collecting taxes, and keeping order in their nomes. Some nomarchs even began to pass their positions to their sons as a matter of course, creating small hereditary lines of power that operated with less direct oversight from Memphis. The capital remained important, yet the balance of influence slowly shifted outward. The economic foundation of the kingdom also faced challenges that the central administration struggled to address. The Nile floods, which had been so reliable for centuries, became less predictable in some years. Lower water levels meant smaller areas of land could be planted, and grain stores in the royal granaries ran lower than usual. Scribes in the provinces recorded periods of scarcity, and officials had to adjust tax collections to avoid leaving villages without enough seed for the next season. Pepi II responded by ordering more careful surveys of the fields and by encouraging local governors to repair canals on their own initiative. These measures helped in the short term, but they also gave the nomarchs even greater practical authority over resources that had once been tightly controlled from the centre. By the final decades of Pepi II's life, the royal court itself showed signs of reduced activity. Fewer major building projects were started in the area around Memphis, and the workshops that had once produced fine statues and reliefs for royal tombs worked on a smaller scale. The king continued to receive reports and to perform the necessary rituals, but the energy that had driven the great constructions of earlier dynasties was no longer as evident. When Pepi II finally died at an advanced age, the succession passed to a series of shorter-lived rulers who belonged to the same family line. These kings of the late 6th dynasty and the brief 7th and 8th dynasties tried to maintain the old forms of government, issuing decrees and keeping the title of pharaoh. but their reigns lasted only a few years each. The smooth transfer of power that had marked earlier transitions became more difficult, and rival claims within the royal family added to the uncertainty. With the central authority in Memphis growing weaker, the nomarchs stepped into the gap more openly. Some governors in the north established a new centre of power at a city called Heracleopolis, where they claimed the right to rule the entire delta and parts of the Middle Valley. At the same time, strong local leaders in the south, centred around the city of Thebes, began to assert their own independence. The country that had been united under one ruler for more than 1,000 years now found itself divided between two main power bases. The period that followed is known as the First Intermediate Period, and it lasted for roughly a century and a half. During this time, no single king controlled the whole length of the Nile, from the First Cataract to the Mediterranean. The division brought changes in how resources moved and how decisions were made. In the northern region under Heracleopolis, the rulers focused on keeping control of the fertile delta lands and the trade routes that connected to the Mediterranean. They repaired local irrigation systems and tried to maintain order among the nomes closest to them. In the south, the Theban leaders concentrated on securing the narrower valley and the routes leading into Nubia. Both sides raised small armies from their local supporters and occasionally clashed along the border zones, yet large-scale warfare was limited. Most of the fighting took the form of raids rather than sustained campaigns, and the ordinary farmers in the villages continued their seasonal work much as before, though they now paid taxes to whichever authority claimed their district. The weakening of the old central government also affected the way officials recorded events. Scribes in different regions began to use slightly different styles of writing and dating, reflecting the lack of a single royal standard. Some inscriptions from this time mention periods of low floods and resulting shortages of grain, which led to localized hardship. Yet the basic skills of farming, crafting, and administration did not disappear. Temples in both the north and the south kept their priesthoods active, performing the daily offerings that had always been part of life along the river. The nomarchs, who now held real power, often described themselves as protectors of their people, building tombs that showed them overseeing the distribution of food during difficult years. The split between north and south created a situation in which new families rose to prominence. In Heracleopolis, the rulers of what historians later called the 9th and 10th dynasties worked to stabilize their territory and even attempted to expand southward when conditions allowed. In Thebes, the governors of the 11th dynasty gradually strengthened their position, improving irrigation in their area and forming alliances with neighboring nomes. These two centers operated independently for decades, each claiming to be the legitimate continuation of the Old Kingdom. The idea of a single ruler over the two lands remained alive in the minds of scribes and priests, yet the practical reality was one of regional control. Throughout this period of divided rule, the Nile itself continued to shape the possibilities and limits of daily existence. When the floods were adequate, villages produced enough to support their local governors and to trade small surpluses with neighbouring districts. When the waters stayed low, communities tightened their belts and relied on stored grain from better years. The nomarchs who managed these local affairs gained experience in handling crises without waiting for instructions from a distant capital. This practical independence helped keep the country functioning, even if the grand projects of the Old Kingdom were no longer attempted. Small temples received repairs, and local craftsmen continued to produce pottery and tools suited to everyday needs. The First Intermediate Period is sometimes remembered as a time of confusion, yet it also allowed for adjustments that would later prove useful. The experience of governing smaller territories taught administrators how to respond quickly to local conditions. Families that had served the old court found new roles under the regional powers. The division, though it weakened the idea of national unity for a time, did not erase the shared language, religion, or agricultural knowledge that had bound the land together for so many centuries. People still looked to the river as the source of life, and the gods of the old pantheon remained part of daily rituals in every nome. As the decades passed, the two main centres of power began to eye each other more closely. The rulers in Thebes started to push northward, seeking to bring more nomes under their influence through diplomacy and occasional military pressure. The Heracleopolitan kings responded by reinforcing their southern borders. These movements set the stage for a new effort at reunification, but that lay in the future. For now, the country existed in a state of regional autonomy, with Memphis no longer the undisputed heart of government. The long reign of Pepi II had marked the end of an era in which one court could direct every aspect of life along the Nile. The systems he left behind had been stretched by time and circumstance, allowing new centres of authority to emerge. The transition from the Old Kingdom to this intermediate phase happened gradually, without a single dramatic break. Pepi II's advanced age and the short reigns that followed simply allowed existing tendencies toward local control to become more pronounced. The nomarchs, who had always been part of the administrative structure, now exercised greater freedom because the central voice in Memphis had grown quieter. The result was a land that was still recognizably Egyptian in its customs and beliefs, yet governed in pieces rather than as a whole. This arrangement would persist until stronger leadership in the south found a way to restore the unity that Narmer had first achieved more than 1,000 years earlier. The quiet shifts that occurred during Pepi II's later years and the decades after his death remind us that even the most enduring kingdoms face moments when their central institutions need time to adapt. The river kept flowing, the fields kept producing according to its rhythm, and the people kept working the land under whatever authority claimed their loyalty at the moment. The first intermediate period, for all its division, preserved the core elements of Egyptian civilization and prepared the way for the next chapter of reunification. The stage was now set for leaders from Thebes to begin the work of bringing the two lands together once more, reunification, under Mentuhotep. The leaders in Thebes, who had gradually extended their influence during the later years of division, belonged to a family that historians would later label the 11th dynasty. The first notable figure among them was a governor named Intef, who strengthened control over several southern nomes and began to style himself as a king with authority reaching beyond his local district. His successors, also named Intef, continued this process by securing the routes into Nubia and improving the irrigation channels that fed the fields around Thebes. These rulers operated from a palace complex built on the east bank of the Nile, where they directed local officials to collect taxes and maintain order in the areas under their sway. The focus remained on practical matters such as ensuring steady water flow and protecting trade caravans moving south, which brought gold and other resources that helped build their strength. One member of this line, Mentuhotep II, whose full royal name was Nebhepetra Mentuhotep, took the throne after his father's short reign and immediately set about expanding the territory that Thebes controlled. He had spent his early years observing how the northern rulers at Heracleopolis managed their delta lands, and how their influence sometimes reached into the Middle Valley. Mentuhotep II understood that lasting stability would require more than local dominance, and he began by appointing trusted men from Theban families to key positions as governors in the nomes closest to his base. These appointments helped create a network of loyal administrators who could report directly to the court and coordinate efforts across a wider region. He also encouraged the repair of neglected canals and the planting of additional fields to increase the grain surplus available for supporting larger groups of workers and soldiers. After several years of careful preparation, Mentuhotep II turned his attention northward in a series of measured campaigns. His forces moved along the river in boats and overland paths, securing one nome after another through a combination of negotiation and, when necessary, direct confrontation with local supporters of the Heracleopolitan kings. The fighting was never on the scale of later empire-building wars, but it involved disciplined groups of spearmen and archers who relied on the logistical support of supply boats carrying grain and weapons. By the 14th year of his reign, the southern and middle parts of the valley were firmly under Theban control. Mentuhotep II then pressed on toward the delta, where the Heracleopolitan rulers had their main centre. The decisive engagements took place near the border zones between the two regions, where Theban troops outmaneuvered the northern defenders and gained control of key crossing points on the Nile. With the fall of Heracleopolis itself, the last organized resistance in the north collapsed, and Mentuhotep II could claim rule over the entire length of the two lands for the first time in more than a century. Once the reunification was achieved, Mentuhotep II worked to restore the administrative systems that had existed in earlier centuries. He re-established Memphis as an important secondary center for government business, sending officials there to oversee the collection of taxes from the Delta nomes and to coordinate the distribution of resources across the country. Scribes once again used a standardized system of dating based on the king's regnal years, and reports from every district flowed back to the court in Thebes, where decisions on major projects and appointments were made. The king confirmed the rights of temples throughout the land to their traditional lands and offerings, which helped rebuild confidence among the priests and local communities. He also appointed a new vizier from a Theban family to serve as the chief administrator, ensuring that the central authority could respond quickly to any local shortages or disputes. Mentuhotep II's approach to governance emphasized balance between the needs of the provinces and the requirements of the unified state. Governors who had shown loyalty during the campaigns were allowed to keep their positions, but they now reported through a clearer chain of command that linked them to the royal court. This arrangement reduced the independence that nomarchs had enjoyed during the period of division, while still drawing on their experience in managing local irrigation and tax collection. The king travelled periodically through the nomes to inspect the work himself, meeting with officials and observing the condition of the fields. These tours helped reinforce the idea that the ruler stood at the centre of the land's well-being, just as the earlier kings had done. But now with Thebes serving as the primary seat of power, the return of unity also opened opportunities for larger building projects that had not been feasible during the divided years. Mentuhotep II directed the construction of a new mortuary temple on the west bank of the Nile at Deir el-Bahri, a site chosen for its natural bay in the cliffs overlooking the river valley. Workers quarried limestone from nearby sources and shaped it into a series of terraces that rose in steps toward the cliff face. The design included colonnaded courts and ramps that allowed processions to move upward, with spaces set aside for daily offerings to sustain the king's spirit. The temple complex also housed shrines dedicated to the gods Amun and Montu, who had become particularly important in Thebes. This project employed craftsmen and labourers from across the reunified kingdom, drawing on the organisational skills that had been preserved in the provinces, and giving people a shared sense of participation in a national effort once more. With the country at peace internally, Mentuhotep II turned some attention to the borders. Expeditions moved south into Nubia to secure the trade routes for gold and stone, while others travelled to the eastern desert to reopen mines that had fallen out of use. The goods that arrived back in Thebes and Memphis supported the workshops that produced tools, pottery, and decorative items for temples and elite households. Trade contacts with the Mediterranean coast resumed on a steadier basis, bringing cedar wood that was used for boat construction and temple doors. These exchanges helped restore the flow of materials that had slowed during the years of division, and the surplus grain stored in royal facilities allowed the court to support a growing number of specialists in administration and craftsmanship. The reunification also influenced the way people in the villages experienced daily life. Farmers in both the north and south now paid their taxes to a single authority, and the standardized collection methods reduced some of the uncertainties they had faced when borders shifted. Irrigation projects that had been started under local governors were now linked into larger networks coordinated from the centre, which improved water distribution in years of lower floods. Communities along the river began to see more boats carrying officials and supplies, and the presence of these travellers reminded them that the land operated as one kingdom again. The king's name appeared on stelae set up in provincial temples, marking the return of royal oversight that had been absent for generations. Mentuhotep II ruled for more than 50 years after achieving unity, giving the new order time to take root. In his later reign, he focused on maintaining the systems he had established, appointing successors to key offices from families that had proven reliable during the campaigns. He also encouraged the development of literature and record-keeping, with scribes producing accounts of the reunification that were copied and preserved in temple libraries. These writings emphasized the king's role in restoring order and protecting the land from the instability that had come before. The court at Thebes grew more formal, with rituals performed according to traditions that combined elements from both northern and southern practices. By the time Mentuhotep II's reign drew to a close, the Middle Kingdom had begun in earnest. His successors in the 11th dynasty continued the work of consolidation, though none matched the length of his rule or the scale of his building at Deir el-Bahri. The transition to the 12th dynasty occurred smoothly when a new family took the throne, building directly on the foundations he had laid. The reunified kingdom now possessed stronger borders, more reliable administration, and a renewed sense of shared purpose among its provinces. Temples across the land received regular support, and the workshops in Memphis and Thebes resumed producing the finer goods that marked periods of stability. The efforts of Mentuhotep II had demonstrated that the two lands could function best when guided by a single center of authority that respected the traditions of every region. His success in ending the division set the pattern for the Middle Kingdom, a time when kings would focus on practical improvements such as expanded irrigation, fortified borders, and steady trade. The temple at Deir el-Bahri stood as a visible reminder of this achievement, its terraces blending with the cliffs and serving as a place where future rulers would come to honor the gods and the memory of the king, who had brought unity back to the Nile. The land that had once been split between rival centers now moved forward together, with the river linking every part of the kingdom in a common rhythm of flood and harvest under a restored central government. Mentuhotep II's long rule also allowed time for the development of new artistic styles that reflected the reunified state. Sculptors created statues showing the king in both traditional poses and more individualized features that captured his role as a restorer. These works were placed in temples and tombs throughout the country, helping to spread a consistent royal image. Officials who had served during the campaigns received rewards of land and titles, which encouraged loyalty and ensured that the administrative class remained invested in the success of the new order. The period after reunification saw a gradual increase in population and agricultural output, as the stability allowed farmers to plan over longer seasons without fear of sudden changes in authority. As the 11th dynasty concluded, the lessons of Mentuhotep II's time shaped the expectations for future kings. The Middle Kingdom would build on his achievements by creating a more balanced system of governance that combined strong central direction with capable local administration. The return of unity had not erased the experiences of the divided years, but had instead incorporated the practical knowledge gained during that time into a stronger framework. The Nile continued to provide the foundation, yet now the entire length of the river operated under one ruler who could direct resources where they were needed most. Mentuhotep II had shown that division could be overcome through steady preparation and decisive action, and his reign marked the beginning of an era in which Egypt would once again project confidence both inside its borders and beyond them. The reunification under Mentuhotep II therefore represented a turning point that carried the country into the Middle Kingdom with renewed institutional strength. The court, the provinces, and the people along the river all benefited from the restored order, setting the stage for further developments in irrigation, trade, and royal building that would define the centuries ahead. The king's work at Deir el-Bahri and his administrative reforms provided a model that his successors would follow and expand, ensuring that the unity achieved after so many years of separation would endure. Stability and expansion in the Middle Kingdom. The successors of Mentuhotep II in the 11th dynasty maintained the unity he had restored, though their reigns were shorter and focused mainly on consolidating control within the borders. The last ruler of that line, Mentuhotep IV, left few major monuments, and the transition to a new family occurred smoothly when a vizier named Amenemhat rose to the throne as Amenemhat I. He came from a Theban background but recognized the practical advantages of a more central location for governing the entire country. Early in his reign, he established a new capital called Ichtawi, which means Sizer of the Two Lands, situated near the entrance to the Fayum Oasis and not far from the old centre at Memphis. This move allowed officials to oversee both the southern valley and the northern delta with greater efficiency, and the court settled into the new palace complex with its administrative buildings and storehouses. Amenemhat I introduced a system of co-regency to ensure smoother successions and reduce the risk of instability. He named his son Senusret as co-ruler during his own lifetime, so that the younger king could gain experience in managing expeditions and provincial affairs, while the father continued to handle major policy decisions. This arrangement became a standard practice for the 12th dynasty and helped the kingdom avoid the disruptions that had followed long reigns in earlier periods. Under their joint direction, the administration reviewed land holdings across the nomes and adjusted tax assessments to reflect current agricultural output. Scribes conducted fresh surveys of fields and canals, which provided more accurate records for planning future projects. One of the most significant developments during the early 12th dynasty was the large-scale improvement of irrigation in the Fayum region. The Fayum was a natural depression west of the Nile that filled with water during the annual flood, creating a large lake. Amenemhat II and his successors directed workers to build canals that connected the depression more directly to the river, allowing controlled flooding and drainage throughout the year. Teams of labourers cleared old channels, constructed earthen dikes, and dug new feeder canals that brought water to thousands of additional acres. The reclaimed land was then planted with emmer wheat, barley, and flax, producing a steady surplus that could be stored in royal granaries or distributed during years of lower floods elsewhere. This project not only increased the total food supply, but also demonstrated the central government's ability to coordinate large public works once more. Senusret I, who ruled first as co-regent and then alone for over 40 years, continued his father's policies while expanding trade and military presence beyond the borders. He sent expeditions south into Nubia to secure the gold mines and the routes that brought ivory and ebony from farther south. At the same time, he strengthened ties with the coastal regions to the northeast, where Egyptian merchants exchanged grain and linen for timber and copper. Within the country, he supported temple building at sites such as Karnak and Heliopolis, ensuring that the priesthoods received regular offerings and that the gods continued to be honoured according to tradition. The court at Ichtawi grew more organised, with departments handling everything from the collection of taxes in kind to the distribution of tools for provincial projects. The next rulers, Amenemhat II and Senusret II, maintained this stability and focused on further agricultural improvements. Senusret II, in particular, expanded the Fayum irrigation network, adding more dikes and sluice gates that allowed farmers to regulate water levels with greater precision. Villages in the region prospered, and new settlements appeared on the newly productive land. Officials from the capital travelled regularly to inspect these works and to record the yields, which helped the government plan for national needs. Trade continued to flourish, with records showing increased imports of cedar logs used for constructing larger boats capable of carrying heavier loads along the Nile. The reign of Senusret III marked a high point of strength and organisation within the Middle Kingdom. He came to the throne after a period of steady growth and immediately turned his attention to securing the southern frontier. Nubia had long been a source of valuable resources, but local groups sometimes disrupted the trade routes. Senusret III led several campaigns deep into the region, reaching as far as the second cataract of the Nile. Rather than relying on temporary raids, he ordered the construction of a series of permanent fortresses along the river. These strongholds, built with thick mud brick walls and watchtowers, housed garrisons of soldiers who patrolled the area and protected trading parties. The forts included storage facilities for grain and weapons, as well as living quarters for the troops and their families. Their strategic placement allowed the Egyptians to control the flow of goods and to respond quickly to any threats from farther south. Senusret III also carried out important administrative reforms that reduced the power of the provincial nomarchs. Many of these local governors had grown influential during the earlier years of the Middle Kingdom, sometimes operating with considerable independence. The king reorganized the country into 3 main administrative regions, north, south, and the area around the capital, and appointed royal officials to oversee each one. These new administrators reported directly to the vizier in Ichtawi, creating a clearer chain of command. The nomarchs retained their local responsibilities for irrigation and tax collection, but lost the ability to maintain private armies or to pass their positions automatically to their sons. Inscriptions from this time show that many former nomarchs accepted the changes and continued to serve the crown in new capacities, while the central government gained tighter control over resources. To improve communication and transport, Senusret III ordered the clearing of a canal around the First Cataract, where rocky outcrops had long hindered boat traffic between Egypt and Nubia. Work crews removed boulders and widened the channel so that larger vessels could pass more easily during the flood season. This engineering project shortened travel times for both military and commercial traffic, and allowed heavier loads of gold and stone to reach the workshops in the north. The king also maintained a strong military presence in the eastern delta, where he built defensive structures to guard against incursions from nomadic groups in the Sinai region. These measures helped keep the borders stable and permitted the interior of the country to focus on peaceful development. Under Senusret III's direction, the court sponsored building projects that reflected the renewed confidence of the state. Temples at Karnak and other sites received additions in the form of new gateways and colonnades, while royal statues depicted the king in a more realistic style that showed the burdens of rule. Artisans in the workshops produced finer jewellery and household items for elite families, and the increased grain supply supported a larger population of scribes and craftsmen. Expeditions continued to bring back exotic materials, including turquoise from the Sinai mines and incense from the Red Sea coast, which were used in temple rituals and for personal adornment. The later years of Senusret III's reign saw the continuation of co-regency when he named his son Amenemhat III as co-ruler. This ensured that the policies of border security and internal organization carried forward without interruption. Amenemhat III oversaw further expansions in the Fayum, completing additional canals and reservoirs that turned the oasis into one of the most productive areas in the kingdom. He also encouraged mining operations in the eastern desert, where new shafts yielded copper and semi-precious stones. Trade with the Levant and the Aegean increased, as evidenced by finds of Egyptian goods in those regions and foreign objects appearing in Egyptian tombs. Throughout the 12th dynasty, the central government at Ichtawi kept detailed records of every aspect of national life. Scribes tracked the height of the Nile flood each year, the amount of grain collected in taxes, and the number of workers assigned to public projects. This information allowed officials to anticipate shortages and to move supplies from surplus areas to regions in need. The system proved resilient even when occasional low floods occurred, because the stored grain and the expanded farmland in the Fayum provided a buffer. Provincial towns along the Nile benefited from this stability. With local temples receiving regular support and markets operating on a more predictable schedule, the Middle Kingdom under these rulers represented a time of balanced growth rather than the massive pyramid construction of earlier centuries. Resources were directed toward practical improvements that benefited the population as a whole, such as better water management and secure trade routes. The army remained professional but was used mainly for defence and escort duties rather than large conquests. This approach allowed the kingdom to thrive internally while projecting strength at the borders. Families in the villages continued their seasonal routines with greater assurance that the central authority would maintain order and provide assistance when needed. By the end of the 12th dynasty, the systems of administration, irrigation, and border defence had become firmly established. Amenemhat III's long reign concluded with the country in a prosperous condition, and the transition to the next ruler followed the now familiar pattern of co-regency. The capital at Ichtawi remained the hub of government, and the fortresses in Nubia continued to function under Egyptian control. The experience gained during this period of stability and expansion would serve the kingdom well in the years ahead, even as new challenges appeared on the horizon. The Middle Kingdom had demonstrated that a unified land could achieve lasting progress through careful planning and steady leadership, setting a standard that later generations would look back upon with respect. The reigns of Senusret III and his immediate successors therefore stand as a clear example of how the restored central authority channeled the country's resources into projects that strengthened both its defences and its agricultural base. The forts along the Nile, the expanded fields in the Fayum, and the streamlined bureaucracy all contributed to a period in which the two lands operated with a sense of shared purpose and practical achievement. The river continued to provide the foundation, but now the government's improvements ensured that its gifts reached more people and supported a more secure kingdom. Forig. Influence and the Hyksos, the 12th dynasty, drew to a close with the long and effective rule of Amenemhat III. The central government at Ichtawi continued to function, but the line of strong kings began to fade. The 13th dynasty that followed consisted of a rapid succession of rulers, many of whom held the throne for only a few years. These kings maintained the royal titles and the basic administrative framework, yet their short reigns limited their ability to launch major projects or respond decisively to emerging pressures. Officials in the provinces kept collecting taxes and managing irrigation as before, but the flow of reports to the capital slowed, and decisions often rested more with local governors. The Fayum irrigation system still produced surplus grain, and trade routes to Nubia and the Mediterranean remained open for a time. Yet the unity that had defined the Middle Kingdom started to loosen at the edges. In the eastern delta, a region long accustomed to contacts with people from the Levant, small groups of migrants from Western Asia began to settle in greater numbers. These newcomers, whom later Egyptian records would call the Hyksos, arrived gradually over several decades. They came as traders, herders, and skilled workers, bringing families and livestock across the Sinai. At first, they integrated into existing communities, adopting elements of Egyptian dress and language while keeping some of their own customs. Their leaders proved adept at local politics, forming alliances with Delta families and gaining control over key trading posts. By the middle of the 17th century BC, one Hyksos family had established itself firmly at a city called Avaris, which lay in the northeastern delta near the Mediterranean coast. From there they expanded their influence northward and westward, eventually claiming royal titles and forming what historians later grouped as the 15th dynasty. The Hyksos rulers at Avaris did not attempt to conquer the entire country at once. Instead, they focused on the fertile delta lands, where they could control the trade routes that brought goods from the Mediterranean and the Levant. They adopted many Egyptian royal practices, using the title of pharaoh, performing traditional offerings in local temples, and employing Egyptian scribes to keep records in the hieroglyphic script. Their capital at Avaris grew into a bustling centre, with palaces built in a style that blended Levantine and Egyptian architecture. Workshops there produced bronze tools and weapons using techniques brought from the East, and the court welcomed craftsmen who knew how to work with new materials. The Hyksos kings maintained diplomatic ties with cities in the Levant, exchanging letters and gifts that strengthened their position. One of the most lasting contributions of the Hyksos period was the introduction of new technologies that would shape Egyptian warfare and transport for centuries. They brought the horse and the light, two-wheeled chariot, which allowed for faster movement across the desert and the fields. Egyptian soldiers quickly learned to use these in their own forces, and the chariot became a standard part of military equipment. Bronze casting improved as well, producing harder and sharper tools and weapons than the copper ones used in earlier times. The Hyksos also introduced the vertical loom for weaving, which sped up textile production, and new styles of pottery that mixed Asian and Egyptian forms. These innovations spread gradually through the delta and into the valley as trade continued between the regions. While the Hyksos controlled the north, a separate line of rulers continued to govern from Thebes in the south. These kings of the 17th dynasty acknowledged the Hyksos as overlords in name only, paying occasional tribute while maintaining their own administration over the southern nomes. They strengthened their hold on the routes into Nubia, securing gold and other resources that helped sustain their court. The Theban rulers kept the old traditions alive, repairing temples and performing the rituals that linked them to the gods Amun and Montu. Their palace on the east bank of the Nile remained a centre of Egyptian culture, where scribes copied texts from earlier periods and artisans produced statues and reliefs in the familiar style. Yet the presence of a foreign dynasty in the north created an undercurrent of tension that grew with each generation. Relations between Avaris and Thebes were complicated. For much of the period, the two centres avoided open conflict, focusing instead on their own territories. Boats still moved up and down the Nile carrying grain, linen and other goods, and merchants from both regions met at border markets. The Hyksos kings sometimes sent messengers to Thebes with requests for cooperation on trade or shared irrigation projects, and the Theban rulers responded in ways that preserved their independence. Over time, however, the Theban kings began to view the division as unsustainable. They strengthened their military forces, training soldiers in the use of the new chariots and bronze weapons that had come from the north. Local governors in the south recruited more men from the villages, and the court at Thebes started to stockpile weapons and supplies. The growing tensions were reflected in the way scribes recorded events. Inscriptions from the south began to describe the Hyksos rulers with terms that suggested they were outsiders who had taken control of part of the land. At the same time, records from Avaris showed the Hyksos kings referring to themselves as legitimate pharaohs who protected the delta and its people. Ordinary Egyptians in the northern villages adapted to the new rulers, paying taxes in grain and labour while continuing to farm the land and worship at local temples. Families in the delta often intermarried with the settlers, creating households that combined Egyptian and Levantine traditions. In the south, people remained more closely tied to the Theban court, looking to their kings for leadership and protection. The Hyksos period also saw continued contacts with other regions beyond Egypt's borders. Traders from the Aegean and the Levant visited Avaris, bringing olive oil, wine and decorative objects that appeared in tombs of the elite. The Hyksos court sent expeditions to the Sinai for turquoise and copper, and they maintained fortresses along the eastern border to guard against further migrations. In the south, the Theban kings kept a close watch on Nubia, where local leaders sometimes challenged Egyptian control. These external links brought new ideas and goods into the country, enriching the material culture even as the political split persisted. By the later years of the 17th dynasty, the Theban rulers had grown bolder. Kings such as Seqenenre-Tau and his successor Kamose began to prepare for direct confrontation. They repaired old forts along the river and trained their troops in coordinated maneuvers using chariots. Messages were sent to potential allies in Nubia and the oases to the west, seeking support against the northern power. The Hyksos king Apepi, who ruled from Avaris at this time, responded by trying to form his own alliances and by sending letters that urged the Nubian leaders to attack the Thebans from the south. These diplomatic moves showed that both sides understood the strategic importance of the regions beyond the Nile Valley. The human impact of the divided rule was felt most directly in the border areas between north and south. Villages there sometimes changed hands as small skirmishes occurred, and farmers learned to store extra grain against the possibility of disrupted trade. Yet daily life along most of the river continued in familiar patterns, with the flood cycle dictating the rhythm of planting and harvest. Temples in both regions received offerings, and priests performed the daily rituals that maintained the connection to the gods. The division had lasted for roughly a century, long enough for a generation of Egyptians to grow up, knowing only the split between Avaris and Thebes. The idea of a single ruler over the two lands remained a powerful memory, preserved in stories and temple inscriptions, and it provided the motivation for the Theban kings to seek reunification. As the conflict approached, the Theban court became a centre of planning and resolve. Scribes recorded the movements of troops and the preparation of supply boats. Artisans produced new weapons and chariots in workshops near the palace. The kings themselves appeared in public ceremonies that reminded the people of their role as protectors of the land and restorers of order. The Hyksos, for their part, strengthened the defences around Avaris, adding walls and training their own chariot forces. The stage was set for a decisive series of campaigns that would determine whether the foreign influence in the north would continue or whether the southern rulers could drive it out and restore unity once more. The arrival and rule of the Hyksos, therefore, represented a significant chapter in which external elements entered Egyptian society and left lasting marks on technology and trade. Their time in the Delta introduced practical advances that the Egyptians adapted and improved, while the political split created the conditions for a new effort at reunification. The tensions that built between Avaris and Thebes were not constant warfare, but a slow accumulation of grievances and ambitions that would soon lead to open conflict. The river still linked the entire land, yet now it also marked the boundary between two different centres of power, each claiming legitimacy in its own way. This period of foreign influence and divided rule tested the resilience of Egyptian institutions and prepared the way for the strong response that would follow from the south. The experiences of these decades showed how the kingdom could absorb new people and ideas without losing its core identity. Temples continued to function, scribes kept records, and farmers tended the fields under whichever authority claimed their loyalty at the moment. The Hyksos had become part of the Egyptian landscape, ruling in Egyptian style while bringing fresh skills that enhanced the country's capabilities. Yet the desire for unity, rooted in the traditions of earlier centuries, remained strong in the south. As the Theban kings gathered their forces, the long era of the Second Intermediate Period was approaching its end, and the next phase would bring a renewed drive to expel the Hyksos and establish a new dynasty that would lead Egypt into its most expansive era, the Wars of Liberation. The tension between Thebes and Avaris had built steadily through the later years of the 17th dynasty, and it fell to a young king named Ahmose to turn that tension into decisive action. Ahmose came to the throne after the death of his brother Kamose, who had already begun probing attacks against Hyksos positions in the Middle Valley. Ahmose was still in his teens when he took full command, but he had been prepared by years of training alongside experienced officers. His mother, Ahotep, played an important supporting role during his early reign, helping to keep order in the southern nomes while her son organised the campaign in the north. From the palace at Thebes, Ahmose directed the gathering of troops from every loyal nome, drawing farmers, boatmen and craftsmen who answered the call to serve the crown. Supply boats were loaded with grain, dried fish and weapons, and the royal workshops produced additional bronze spearheads and arrow tips using the techniques that had entered the country during the Hyksos period. Ahmose began his advance by securing the area just north of Thebes, clearing any remaining pockets of resistance and ensuring that supply lines remained open. He then moved methodically northward along the Nile, capturing key towns and forts that the Hyksos had used to control movement on the river. Each captured position was placed under a trusted Egyptian commander, and local officials were confirmed in their roles if they swore loyalty to the Theban king. The campaign stretched over several years, with the army returning to Thebes during the height of the flood season to rest and resupply before pushing forward again. Ahmose used both land forces and a fleet of boats that could transport troops quickly and deliver supplies directly to the front. The chariot units, now fully integrated into the Egyptian army, provided speed and mobility that allowed the king to outmaneuver Hyksos defenders. The decisive phase of the war centered on the siege of Avaris itself. Ahmose's forces surrounded the Hyksos capital, cutting off its access to the sea and blocking the main roads. The siege lasted several months, with Egyptian troops making repeated assaults on the walls, while defenders inside used the new bronze weapons and chariots to hold their ground. Ahmose coordinated the effort from a forward camp, receiving daily reports from his officers and adjusting tactics as conditions changed. Eventually the pressure became too great, and the Hyksos ruler Kamudi agreed to terms that allowed his people to leave the city and withdraw toward the northeast. The Egyptian army entered Avaris in an orderly manner, and Ahmose immediately set about restoring Egyptian administration in the delta. He appointed officials from Theban families to key positions and ordered the repair of temples and canals that had suffered during the years of divided rule. With the northern capital secured, Ahmose turned his attention to the borders. He led a campaign into southern Palestine to pursue any remaining Hyksos forces and to prevent them from regrouping. Egyptian troops reached as far as the town of Sharuhan, where they captured the last significant stronghold and secured the eastern approaches to the delta. These actions ensured that the threat from the northeast would not return quickly. At the same time, Ahmose sent expeditions south into Nubia to reassert control over the gold mines and trade routes that had grown less secure during the period of division. The Nubian campaigns were shorter but effective, and they brought back resources that helped rebuild the royal treasury. Once the fighting ended, Ahmose focused on restoring the unity of the two lands in practical ways. He travelled through the country, visiting Memphis and other important centres to confirm the loyalty of local governors and to inspect the condition of the fields and irrigation works. He ordered a fresh survey of all nomes so that taxes could be collected fairly and resources directed where they were most needed. The king also began repairing and enlarging temples that had been neglected, starting with important sites at Karnak and Abydos. These building projects employed thousands of workers and gave people across the country a sense of participation in the new order. Ahmose rewarded soldiers and officials who had served faithfully during the wars with grants of land and positions at court, which helped create a loyal core of administrators for the coming years. The founding of the 18th dynasty, with Ahmose as its first king, marked the clear beginning of the new kingdom. He established Thebes as the main religious and political centre, while Memphis remained important for administration and as a base for northern affairs. The court developed new departments to handle the increased volume of records that came with reunification, and scribes once again used a standardized dating system based on the king's regnal years. Ahmose married his sister Ahmose Nefertari, who became an influential queen and later served as regent for their son. This royal family provided continuity and helped stabilize the early years of the new dynasty. Ahmose's military successes also allowed the kingdom to resume larger-scale trade. Boats once again sailed regularly to the Levant for cedar wood and to the Red Sea coast for incense and exotic goods. The increased resources supported the rebuilding effort and allowed artisans to resume producing fine statues, reliefs and jewellery. The introduction of the horse and chariot during the Hyksos period was now fully absorbed into Egyptian society, with royal stables established near the palaces and training programs for drivers and archers. These new capabilities strengthened the army, which Ahmose reorganized into more professional units that could respond quickly to threats on any border. Throughout the country, the end of the wars brought a return to the familiar agricultural cycle. Farmers in the delta and the valley planted their fields after the flood with greater confidence that the harvest would reach the royal storehouses without interference. Villages repaired homes and canals damaged during the conflict, and local temples resumed their regular festivals. The king's name began to appear on stelae set up in towns from Nubia to the Mediterranean, reminding people that a single ruler once again governed the entire land. Children born in the early years of Ahmose's reign grew up hearing stories of the liberation campaigns, which reinforced their sense of belonging to a restored kingdom. Ahmose ruled for about 25 years after the fall of Avaris, giving the new dynasty time to take firm root. In his later reign, he focused on internal development, ordering the construction of a new royal residence area at Thebes and supporting the expansion of the Temple of Amun at Karnak. He also ensured that the mortuary cult for his predecessors was maintained, linking the new dynasty to the traditions of earlier kings. When Ahmose died, the throne passed smoothly to his son Amenhotep I, who continued the policies of border security and temple building. The transition demonstrated that the systems put in place during the Wars of Liberation were already functioning effectively. The wars that Ahmose led had been fought with a clear purpose: to remove foreign control from Egyptian soil and to restore the unity that had defined the country for most of its history. The conflict was not a sudden explosion, but the result of years of preparation, careful campaigning, and determined leadership. The technologies the Hyksos had introduced were kept and improved, while the political division was brought to an end. The new kingdom that emerged from these campaigns would become the most expansive and powerful phase of ancient Egyptian civilization, with a professional army, a strong central court, and far-reaching trade networks. Ahmose's achievement lay in combining military skill with administrative wisdom. He knew that victory on the battlefield had to be followed by fair governance and economic recovery if the unity was to last. His careful treatment of the Delta after the siege, his confirmation of local officials, and his investment in temples and irrigation all helped heal the divisions created by the Hyksos period. The Queen Ahotep and later Ahmose Nefertari provided additional stability, showing that royal women could play essential roles in both military and civil affairs. The 18th dynasty therefore began on a foundation of restored order and renewed confidence. As the years after the liberation passed, the memory of the wars remained alive in official inscriptions and popular stories. Soldiers who had marched with Ahmose received honours and land, and their families took pride in the part they had played. The chariot forces that had proven so effective became a symbol of the new military strength, and the bronze weapons produced in Egyptian workshops equipped a standing army that could defend the borders without relying on temporary levies. The river once again served as a single highway linking the entire kingdom, with boats carrying grain, troops, and building stone under the protection of a unified government. The successful conclusion of the Wars of Liberation therefore marked more than the expulsion of the Hyksos. It represented the reassertion of Egyptian control over its own destiny and the opening of a new era in which the country would project its power far beyond the Nile Valley. Ahmose had not only driven out the foreign rulers but had also rebuilt the institutions needed for long-term stability. The new kingdom was now underway, with Thebes as its religious heart and a king who understood both the demands of war and the requirements of peaceful rule. The land that had been divided for more than a century stood united again, ready to enter its period of greatest imperial reach under the pharaohs who would follow Ahmose's example. Empire and conquest with the new kingdom, firmly established under the early kings of the 18th dynasty. The throne passed through a sequence of rulers who continued the work of securing borders and rebuilding internal strength. After Ahmose and his immediate successors, the line reached Thutmose II, whose death left a young son, Thutmose III, as the nominal heir. For the first 22 years of the boy's reign, real authority rested with his stepmother and aunt, Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in her own right. During that time, the court at Thebes focused on trade expeditions and temple construction rather than large military campaigns. When Hatshepsut died, Thutmose III, now in his early 20s, took sole control and immediately turned his attention to the northeastern territories where local rulers had grown restless and formed coalitions against Egyptian influence. Thutmose III had spent his years under the regency training. As a soldier and administrator, he understood the importance of a strong army equipped with chariots and bronze weapons, and he had studied the geography of the lands beyond the Sinai. In the first year of his independent rule, he assembled a large force at the border fortress of Charu and marched toward Gaza, which served as the gateway into the region known as Ret Jenu. From there, the army moved northward along the coast, before turning inland toward the city of Megiddo, where a coalition of Canaanite princes had gathered under the leadership of the ruler of Kadesh. Thutmose III faced a choice of routes: a long, safe road around the Carmel Ridge or a narrow, risky pass directly through the mountains. He chose the direct path despite the advice of his officers, moving his troops in single file through the defile. The surprise was complete. The enemy forces, expecting the longer route, were caught off guard, and the Egyptian army emerged onto the plain north of Megiddo ready for battle. The fighting at Megiddo lasted through the day, with Egyptian chariots charging the enemy lines while infantry supported from the flanks. By evening the coalition had broken, and many of the opposing leaders fled into the city, which then endured a siege of 8 months. When Megiddo finally surrendered, Thutmose III accepted the submission of the princes, collected a large quantity of weapons, chariots, and horses as tribute, and installed loyal governors in the captured towns. He did not destroy the city or slaughter its people. Instead, he took the sons of the local rulers back to Egypt as hostages, where they would be raised at court and later returned to govern their territories with an Egyptian outlook. This approach became a standard part of his policy in the years that followed. Over the next 2 decades, Thutmose III conducted at least 16 more campaigns into the northeast, moving systematically through the coastal cities and inland valleys of what is now Lebanon and Syria. He captured ports such as Ulaza and Samira, turning them into supply bases where Egyptian ships could unload grain and weapons while loading cedar timber for the return voyage. He advanced up the Bekaa Valley, neutralizing the power of Kadesh, and in his 33rd regnal year he launched his most ambitious operation yet. Pontoon boats were built in sections, loaded onto ox carts, and transported across Syria so the army could cross the Euphrates River. On the far bank, the Egyptians met the forces of the kingdom of Mitanni. The Mitannian king fled, leaving behind members of his household and soldiers who were captured. Thutmose III set up a commemorative stela beside the river, near the one left by his grandfather Thutmose I, marking the farthest point of Egyptian advance. These campaigns were not continuous wars of destruction but carefully planned operations that combined fighting with administration. After each season's battles, the king returned to Thebes to celebrate triumphs and dedicate portions of the captured goods to the temple of Amun at Karnak. Scribes travelling with the army, led by the royal scribe Tianeni, recorded the events in detail. These annals were later carved on the walls of the temple, providing a day-by-day account of marches, councils of war, and the quantities of tribute received. The lists included gold, silver, bronze, timber, cattle, grain, and even exotic animals and plants that Thutmose III brought back to Egypt. The wealth that flowed into the royal treasury supported further building projects and allowed the court to maintain a large professional army. To hold the newly won territories, Thutmose III established a network of garrisons at strategic points along the coast and in the highlands. Egyptian overseers, titled Overseers of Foreign Lands, resided in key cities and collected regular tribute from the local vassal rulers. These vassals swore oaths of loyalty and sent their sons to Egypt for education, ensuring that the next generation of leaders would remain friendly to the pharaoh. Fortresses were strengthened or newly built, and roads were improved to allow faster movement of troops and supplies. The system reduced the need for constant large-scale campaigning after the initial conquests, allowing the king to focus on consolidation in his later years. In the south, Thutmose III reaffirmed Egyptian control over Nubia, extending the boundary as far as the area near Napata. He built a temple to Amun there, and employed local Nubian workers in the gold mines that now supplied much of the kingdom's wealth. The tribute from Nubia, combined with the riches from the northeast, created a level of prosperity that supported artisans, scribes, and priests across the country. Boats travelled regularly between Thebes and the delta, carrying grain from the north to feed the growing population and luxury goods from abroad to adorn the temples and palaces. Thutmose III also attended to internal administration. He reorganized the bureaucracy so that the vizier in Thebes and another in Memphis could coordinate more effectively with the provincial governors. Taxes were assessed more accurately based on updated surveys of farmland, and the royal granaries held reserves that could be distributed during years of low flood. The king encouraged the development of new skills among craftsmen, particularly in glassmaking and metalworking, which benefited from the influx of raw materials from the empire. Temples throughout the land received support, with the greatest attention given to Karnak, where Thutmose III added halls, obelisks, and a festival court decorated with images of the foreign plants and animals he had brought back from his campaigns. By the final 12 years of his reign, Thutmose III had largely completed the military phase of his rule. He appointed his son Amenhotep II as co-regent to ensure a smooth transition, and he spent more time at home overseeing building projects and receiving envoys from distant lands. Gifts arrived from Crete, Cyprus, Babylonia, Assyria, and the Hittites, reflecting Egypt's new status as the dominant power in the region. tombs of high officials from this period show scenes of foreign delegations presenting tribute before the pharaoh, a visual record of the empire's reach. Thutmose III died after a reign of 54 years and was buried in the Valley of the Kings on the West Bank at Thebes. His mortuary temple and the many monuments he left behind preserved the memory of his achievements. Later generations remembered him as a great warrior and a capable administrator who had expanded the borders without exhausting the country's resources. The systems he put in place for governing the empire continued to function under his successors, bringing steady tribute that supported the building programs and cultural life of the new kingdom at its height. The empire, created by Thutmose III, stretched from the Euphrates in the north to the fourth cataract of the Nile in the south. It was not a single centralized state, but a collection of vassal territories linked by loyalty to the pharaoh, military garrisons, and regular flows of goods. This arrangement brought new ideas, materials, and people into Egypt, while allowing the core institutions along the Nile to remain distinctly Egyptian. The professional army, the improved administration, and the wealth from tribute all contributed to a period of stability and confidence that would last for generations. Thutmose III's approach combined bold military strategy with careful political management. He led from the front in battle, yet treated conquered peoples with measured humanity, preferring integration over destruction. His annals at Karnak and the network of governors he established provided the framework that kept the empire functioning long after his death. The river that had always united the two lands now served as the central artery of a much larger domain, with boats carrying not only grain and stone, but also the products of distant regions that enriched every level of society. The era of conquest under Thutmose III therefore represented the peak of Egyptian territorial power. The king had taken the momentum gained from the wars of liberation and channeled it into a structured empire that brought security and prosperity to the homeland. His successors would inherit a strong position, though maintaining it would require continued attention to both borders and internal affairs. For the time being, however, the land along the Nile enjoyed the benefits of victory and wise governance, with the temples at Karnak standing as permanent witnesses to the achievements of a ruler who had extended Egyptian influence farther than any before him. Hatshepsut and Akhenaten, the empire built through years of careful campaigning, brought a steady flow of tribute and resources that allowed the 18th dynasty to turn its attention inward once more. One ruler who had already demonstrated how such stability could support ambitious projects was Hatshepsut, who had taken the throne as pharaoh after serving as regent for her stepson Thutmose III. She governed for more than 20 years in her own right, directing affairs from the palace at Thebes while maintaining the systems of administration that kept the nomes supplied and the borders secure. Hatshepsut came from a family that valued tradition yet was open to innovation, and she surrounded herself with capable officials who understood both the practical needs of the kingdom and the importance of public works that reinforced royal authority. Early in her independent rule, Hatshepsut focused on restoring and enlarging temples across the land, particularly at Karnak, where she added new gateways and shrines dedicated to Amun. She also ordered the quarrying of 2 large obelisks from the granite quarries at Aswan, which were transported by river barge and erected at Karnak to mark her devotion to the gods. These projects employed teams of skilled stoneworkers and labourers who had gained experience during earlier building phases, and they helped employ people from villages along the Nile during the flood season when farm work paused. Hatshepsut's court kept detailed records of the materials used and the workers fed from royal storehouses, ensuring that the efforts ran smoothly and that the surplus from the empire supported every stage. One of the most notable undertakings during her reign was the expedition to the land of Punt, a region far to the south along the Red Sea coast that supplied incense, ebony, and exotic animals. Hatshepsut assembled a fleet of 5 large ships fitted with sails and oars, each capable of carrying a full crew and cargo. The expedition sailed from a port on the Red Sea, guided by experienced captains who had traded in southern waters before. When the ships returned after several months, They brought back live myrrh trees with their roots carefully packed in baskets, along with gold, ivory, leopard skins, and sacks of fragrant resin. The trees were planted in the gardens of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple, where they thrived and provided a continuing supply of incense for temple rituals. Scenes of the expedition and its cargo were carved in relief on the walls of the temple at Deir el-Bahri, showing the ships loading goods and the people of Punt offering tribute. The mortuary temple Hatshepsut, built for herself at Deir el-Bahri, stood on the west bank opposite Thebes, set against the cliffs in a series of 3 rising terraces connected by ramps. Architects designed it with rows of columns that created shaded walkways, and the walls featured inscriptions praising the queen's achievements and her close relationship with the gods. Inside the upper terrace, chapels honoured Amun and other deities, while the central sanctuary held statues of Hatshepsut herself. Workers used limestone blocks quarried nearby, and finer granite for doorways, fitting everything with the precision that had become standard in royal construction. The temple complex included gardens and a long causeway leading down to the river, where boats could dock during festivals. Priests maintained daily offerings there long after Hatshepsut's death, ensuring that her spirit continued to receive the sustenance believed necessary for the afterlife. Hatshepsut also strengthened trade routes within Egypt and beyond its borders. Merchants moved goods more freely between the delta and the southern nomes, and expeditions continued to bring copper from Sinai and turquoise from the eastern desert. She appointed officials to oversee these activities, many of them drawn from families that had served the earlier kings of the dynasty. One of her most trusted advisors was Senenmut, who held several high positions and supervised much of the building work at Deir el-Bahri. His tomb near the temple contained statues and inscriptions that recorded his role in the queen's projects. Under Hatshepsut's direction, the kingdom experienced a period of calm prosperity in which agriculture flourished, craftsmen refined their skills, and the court at Thebes became a centre for learning and artistic production. After Hatshepsut's reign ended and Thutmose III assumed full control, the patterns she had established continued to guide the dynasty. The following kings, including Amenhotep II and Thutmose IV, maintained the empire's borders and the flow of tribute while focusing on temple repairs and military readiness. By the time Amenhotep III came to the throne, the country had enjoyed decades of peace and accumulated wealth that allowed for an even greater level of cultural and architectural activity. Amenhotep III ruled for nearly 40 years, during which he oversaw the construction of massive temples and palaces, many of them at Thebes and Memphis. He married a commoner named Tiye, who became a powerful queen and whose influence helped shape court policies. Their son, who would later take the name Akhenaten, grew up in this environment of abundance and royal ritual. Akhenaten's early years as co-regent with his father followed the traditional ways, but after he became sole ruler, he began to introduce changes that altered the religious landscape of the kingdom. He promoted the worship of a single deity, the Aten, represented as the sun disk with rays ending in hands that offered life to the king and his family. This focus on the Aten gradually replaced the older cults of Amun and other gods in the official ceremonies at court. Akhenaten changed his own name from Amenhotep, meaning Amun is satisfied, to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten. He ordered the construction of new temples dedicated solely to the Aten, first at Karnak and then in a completely new city he founded midway between Thebes and Memphis. The new capital, called Akhetaten or Horizon of the Aten, was built on a stretch of desert land on the east bank of the Nile. Planners laid out a main road that ran parallel to the river, with palaces, administrative buildings, and open-air temples spaced along it. The temples featured wide courts where the sun could shine directly on altars, without the enclosed sanctuaries typical of earlier designs. Families of officials and craftsmen moved to the city with the king, and the population grew quickly as supply boats arrived daily with food and building materials. Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti appeared frequently in public processions along the main road, riding in chariots and distributing gifts to favoured courtiers. Artisans working in the city developed a new style of sculpture and painting, that showed the royal family in more relaxed, intimate poses, with elongated features and rounded bellies that emphasized life and movement rather than the formal stiffness of older royal images. The shift to the Aten cult affected many aspects of daily administration. Temples to the older gods lost their funding from the royal treasury, and their priesthoods were instructed to redirect resources toward the new capital. Scribes began to use a simplified form of the language in official records, making documents easier to read and write. The king composed hymns praising the Aten as the creator of all life, and these texts were copied and displayed in tombs and temples around Akhetaten. Yet the changes did not extend evenly across the entire country. In the provinces, farmers continued to plant and harvest according to the Nile's cycle, and local officials kept the irrigation canals clear even as the focus of royal attention moved north. Akhenaten's reign lasted 17 years, during which the court at Akhetaten maintained close control over foreign correspondence. Letters from vassal rulers in the northeast arrived regularly, written on clay tablets in the diplomatic language of the time, and the king's scribes replied with instructions on maintaining order in the empire. Some letters complained of unrest or requests for military aid, showing that the empire still required active management even as the king concentrated on religious matters at home. Nefertiti played a prominent role in the new ceremonies, often shown alongside Akhenaten performing offerings to the Aten. Their 6 daughters appeared in many reliefs, reinforcing the image of the royal family as the central link between the sun disk and the people. Toward the end of Akhenaten's rule, the court faced challenges from disease outbreaks and possible pressure from officials who preferred the older religious traditions. The king's health may have declined, and the city of Akhetaten began to show signs of reduced activity. When Akhenaten died, the throne passed first to a short-lived successor and then to a young king named Tutankhamun, who soon changed his name to Tutankhamun and moved the court back to Thebes. The new administration restored support to the traditional temples and gradually abandoned the city at Akhetaten, which was left to the desert sands. The religious experiment ended, but the art and ideas developed during those years left traces in later works, and the correspondence found at the site provided later generations with a clear picture of how the empire had been governed. The period that included Hatshepsut's steady leadership and Akhenaten's bold reforms showed the range of possibilities within the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut had used the kingdom's prosperity to build lasting monuments and expand trade, while Akhenaten had attempted to reshape the relationship between the ruler and the divine. Both approaches relied on the administrative and economic foundation laid by earlier kings, and both left the country with new temples, new artistic styles, and new ways of recording royal actions. The Nile continued to provide the rhythm of life for farmers and officials alike, and the empire's borders remained largely intact despite the internal shifts at court. After Tutankhamun's brief reign, the dynasty continued under military leaders who restored stability and turned their attention once more to external affairs. Yet the achievements of Hatshepsut and the innovations of Akhenaten remained part of the historical record, preserved in inscriptions and abandoned city ruins that future scribes would study. The dynasty had demonstrated that a unified land could support both traditional building programs and radical changes in belief, each in its own time. The river valley that had seen unification centuries earlier now witnessed these varied expressions of royal power, all of them drawing on the same resources of grain, labour, and skilled administration that had sustained Egyptian civilization through every phase. Restoration and the age of Ramses. After the short reign of Tutankhamun and the brief rule of his successor Ai, a military officer named Horemheb took the throne and began the work of restoring the traditional order that had been disrupted during the years at Akhetaten. Horemheb had served as a general under previous kings and understood the importance of a strong army and a functioning bureaucracy. He issued decrees that reorganized the courts, reduced corruption among officials, and directed resources back to the temples of Amun at Karnak and other major shrines. Scribes once again recorded dates by the regnal years of the king in Thebes, and the old priesthoods received renewed support so they could resume their daily rituals and festivals. Horemheb also strengthened the borders, particularly in the northeast, where small raids had begun to test Egyptian control. His efforts laid a stable foundation for the next family of rulers. The 19th dynasty opened when Ramses I, an experienced army officer chosen by Horemheb as his successor, came to the throne. His reign was short, but he passed power smoothly to his son Seti I, who ruled for about 15 years and focused on both military campaigns and building projects. Seti I led expeditions into the northeast to reassert authority over territories that had grown restless, and he fought against groups in Libya to the west. At home he enlarged the temple of Amun at Karnak and began construction of a grand mortuary temple at Abydos, where reliefs showed him offering to the gods of the traditional pantheon. These projects helped restore confidence among the people and demonstrated that the king once again honoured the old ways while maintaining the strength of the empire. Seti I's son, Ramses II, came to the throne as a young man and would rule for 67 years, becoming one of the longest reigning and most active kings of the new kingdom. Ramses II had already gained military experience under his father and quickly set about securing the empire's northern borders. In his 4th regnal year he led an army toward the city of Kadesh on the Orontes River, where the Hittite king Mu'attali had gathered a large force. The Egyptian army advanced in 4 divisions, but the Hittites ambushed the leading division near Kadesh. Ramses II found himself surrounded with only his personal guard, yet he rallied his troops and fought until reinforcements arrived. The battle ended without a clear victory for either side, but both kings later claimed success in their own records. Several years afterward, Ramses II and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a formal peace treaty, the earliest known surviving example of such a document. The treaty was recorded on silver tablets and copied onto temple walls in Egypt, promising mutual aid and non-aggression. It was sealed by royal marriages, with Hittite princesses joining the Egyptian court. With the northern frontier stabilized by the treaty, Ramses II turned his attention to building on a scale that rivaled the great projects of earlier dynasties. He completed the temple at Abydos, begun by his father, and added his own magnificent mortuary temple, the Ramesseum, on the west bank at Thebes. The Ramesseum featured a huge seated statue of the king, colossal columns, and storerooms that could hold vast quantities of grain for distribution to the people. Far to the south, at Abu Simbel, near the Second Cataract, Ramses II ordered the carving of 2 rock-cut temples directly into the sandstone cliffs. The larger temple showed 4 gigantic seated figures of the king on the facade, each more than 65 feet high. Inside, halls led to a sanctuary where the sun's rays illuminated statues of the king and the gods on certain days of the year. A smaller temple nearby honoured the Queen Nefertari. These monuments served both religious and political purposes, reminding the Nubian population and travellers along the Nile of the pharaoh's power. Ramses II also founded a new capital city in the eastern delta called Pi-Ramesses. The site had been used earlier as a summer residence, but the king expanded it into a major administrative and military centre, with palaces, temples, barracks and workshops. Its location near the border allowed faster response to any threats from the northeast, and made it easier to launch expeditions into the Levant. The city included quarters for foreign residents, including Hittite envoys who lived there after the peace treaty. Canals connected Pi-Ramesses to the Nile, and harbours received ships bringing cedar from Lebanon and other goods from across the empire. The court spent part of each year there, especially during the cooler months, while Thebes remained the primary religious centre. Throughout his long reign, Ramses II fathered many children. More than 100 sons and daughters are recorded, and he appointed several of them to important positions. His eldest sons often led military campaigns or served as priests, while daughters took part in royal ceremonies and diplomatic marriages. The Queen Nefertari was particularly prominent in the early years, and after her death another wife, Isetnofret, and later daughters assumed important roles at court. This large royal family helped ensure continuity and provided capable administrators for the growing bureaucracy. Ramses II also maintained close ties with the priesthood of Amun, granting them lands and privileges while keeping ultimate authority in his own hands. The prosperity of the age supported a high level of artistic and literary activity. Scribes copied older texts and composed new ones, praising the king's victories and building achievements. Artisans produced fine jewellery, furniture, and household items for the elite, many of which were placed in tombs in the Valley of the Kings. The increased wealth from tribute and trade allowed ordinary people in the villages to enjoy more stable lives, with regular distributions of grain from royal storehouses during years when the flood was lower than usual. Farmers continued to plant emmer and barley after the waters receded, and craftsmen in the workshops near the temples and palaces worked steadily on royal commissions. In his later years, Ramses II celebrated multiple Jubilee festivals, marking 30 years and then additional decades on the throne, with grand ceremonies at Pi-Ramesses and Thebes. These events included processions, offerings to the gods, and public distributions of food and gifts. The king appeared in public wearing the double crown and carrying the traditional symbols of rule, reinforcing the idea that he maintained the order of the two lands. Foreign envoys attended the Jubilees, bringing tribute and acknowledging Egyptian dominance. By the time Ramses II died at about 90 years old, he had outlived many of his sons, and the throne passed to his 13th son, Merneptah. Merneptah faced immediate challenges on the western border, where a coalition of Libyan tribes and groups from the Mediterranean islands, later called the Sea Peoples, attempted to enter the delta. He defeated them in a major battle in his 5th regnal year, recording the victory on a stela that also mentioned a campaign in Canaan, where the name Israel appears for the first time in Egyptian records. Merneptah maintained the peace treaty with the Hittites and continued the building programs on a smaller scale, but the long reign of his father had set a high standard that later kings found difficult to match. The age of Ramses II therefore represented the last great flourishing of the new kingdom's power and confidence. His military campaigns, diplomatic successes, and monumental building projects left a lasting imprint on the landscape from the Delta to Nubia. The peace treaty with the Hittites brought decades of stability along the northern frontier, while the new capital at Pi-Ramesses strengthened control over the eastern approaches. Temples and statues bearing his name stood as visible reminders of royal authority for centuries afterward. The systems of administration, taxation, and military organization that had developed since the early 18th dynasty reached their fullest expression during his reign, supporting both external security and internal prosperity. After Merneptah, the 19th dynasty continued for a few more reigns, but the country began to face increasing difficulties with lower Nile floods, reduced tribute from the empire, and pressure from groups along the borders. Yet the memory of Ramses II endured, and later kings often took his name in the hope of reviving the strength he had shown. His long life and active rule had given the kingdom a period of remarkable stability and grandeur that would be remembered as one of the high points of ancient Egyptian history. The river continued to flow through the heart of the land, sustaining the fields and carrying boats between the great cities, while the monuments he left behind stood guard over the achievements of an era when one king could direct the resources of a vast domain toward works that endured for millennia, decline, and invasions. After the long and active rule of Ramses II and the shorter reign of his son Merneptah, the 19th dynasty came to an end with a series of brief kings who struggled to maintain the same level of control. The early years of the 20th dynasty brought one final strong ruler in the form of Ramses III, who faced immediate threats from groups known as the Sea Peoples. These migrants and warriors from the Mediterranean islands and coastal regions had already disrupted trade and settlements across the eastern Mediterranean. In his 8th regnal year, Ramses III prepared the Egyptian army and navy to meet them on two fronts. The land forces clashed along the eastern border, while the fleet engaged the invaders at the mouths of the Nile. Egyptian chariots and archers broke the enemy formations, and the ships used grappling hooks to pull enemy vessels close for hand-to-hand fighting. The victory was recorded in detail on the walls of Ramses III's mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, where scenes showed the king overseeing the battles and the defeated sea peoples being led away as captives. Some of the prisoners were settled in military colonies within Egypt, where they served in the army and introduced new skills in metalworking. Ramses III also dealt with a Libyan incursion in his 6th year, defeating a coalition that had crossed the Western Desert. These campaigns secured the borders for a time, but they drained resources that the treasury could ill afford. The cost of maintaining a large standing army and repairing damage from earlier low floods added to the strain. Toward the end of his 31-year reign, economic difficulties appeared more clearly. Workers at the royal tomb sites near Thebes went on strike when their monthly grain rations arrived late. Officials resolved the dispute by distributing emergency supplies from temple storehouses, but the incident showed that the central government was having trouble keeping the regular flow of payments to its employees. Scribes recorded the event in official journals, noting the names of the foremen and the exact amounts owed. Despite these problems, Ramses III continued building at Medinet Habu, adding a large enclosure wall and decorative reliefs that celebrated his victories and reinforced the image of a strong pharaoh protecting the land. After Ramses III's death, the throne passed through a line of 8 more kings, all named Ramses, whose reigns grew progressively shorter and less effective. The empire in the northeast began to slip away as local rulers in Canaan and Syria stopped sending regular tribute and asserted greater independence. Egyptian garrisons in those regions were reduced or withdrawn, and the flow of cedar wood and other goods from the Levant slowed to a trickle. In Nubia, the southern forts remained under Egyptian control a while longer, but the gold mines produced less as the easier deposits were exhausted. At home, the administration in Thebes and the Delta faced growing challenges from powerful priests and local officials who controlled large estates and temple lands. The high priest of Amun at Karnak, Herihor, held both religious and military titles and effectively governed the southern part of the country. His family intermarried with the royal line, further blurring the lines between priesthood and kingship. By the end of the 20th dynasty, the central authority had weakened enough that the country split once more into northern and southern centres of power. The last Ramses, Ramses XI, ruled in name only, while real decisions rested with officials in Thebes and a new leader named Smendes, who established himself at Tanis in the eastern delta. When Ramses II died, Smendes took the throne as the first king of the 21st dynasty and moved the royal residence to Tanis. The new capital was built using stone blocks transported from older sites, including Pi-Ramesses, and it became the political centre for the north. In the south, the high priests of Amun at Thebes continued to manage their own affairs, collecting taxes and maintaining order in the southern nomes. The two regions cooperated on matters of trade and irrigation, but the unified command that had marked the height of the new kingdom was gone. Kings in Tanis and high priests in Thebes exchanged letters and occasional marriages to keep relations smooth, yet each operated with considerable independence. The third intermediate period that followed lasted roughly 4 centuries and saw a series of dynasties with mixed Egyptian and foreign origins. Libyan groups who had settled in the western delta during earlier decades gradually rose to prominence. One Libyan chief named Shoshenku seized the throne around 945 BC and founded the 22nd dynasty. He ruled from Bubastis in the delta and appointed his son as high priest of Amun at Thebes to keep the south aligned with his policies. Shoshenku even led a campaign into Canaan, reaching Jerusalem and collecting tribute that helped replenish the royal treasury. His successors continued to balance power between the delta and the valley, but over time the Libyan kings faced challenges from rival families within their own ranks. Local princes in the delta cities such as Leontopolis and Sais declared their own independent lines, creating overlapping claims to the throne. During these decades, the priesthood at Thebes grew even stronger. Some high priests effectively acted as rulers of Upper Egypt, issuing decrees and leading their own small military forces. Temples in the south received generous land grants and operated as self-contained economic units with their own workshops, farms, and storehouses. In the north, the kings at Tanis and later Bubastis focused on maintaining trade contacts with the Levant and the Mediterranean. Ships continued to sail from the delta ports, bringing in timber and metals, but the quantities were smaller than in earlier centuries. Nubia, once tightly controlled, began to develop its own centres of power. Local leaders in the region around Napata revived the worship of Ammon, and eventually formed their own kingdom that would later play a role in Egyptian affairs. By the middle of the 8th century BC, a new force appeared from the south. The kings of Kush, centred at Napata, had adopted many Egyptian customs and now claimed the right to rule the entire Nile Valley. Pianki, also known as Piye, led his army northward in a campaign that brought most of Upper Egypt under his control. He respected the temples and performed the traditional rituals at Karnak, presenting himself as a restorer of order rather than a conqueror. His successor Shabaka moved the capital to Memphis and ruled over a reunited land that stretched from the delta to the Fourth Cataract. The 25th dynasty, as these Kushite rulers are known, governed for about 70 years. They repaired temples, revived older artistic styles, and strengthened the borders against threats from the east. Yet they also faced growing pressure from the expanding Assyrian Empire in Mesopotamia, which had already conquered much of the Levant. The Assyrians launched several invasions into Egypt during the later years of the 25th dynasty. In 671 BC, their king Esarhaddon captured Memphis and forced the Kushite ruler Taharqa to retreat south. A few years later, Ashurbanipal pushed even farther, sacking Thebes and carrying away treasures from the temples. The Kushite kings withdrew to their southern heartland, and a new local family from Sais in the delta took advantage of the power vacuum. Psamtik I, founder of the 26th dynasty, gradually extended his control over the entire country with the help of Greek and Carian mercenaries who fought with iron weapons and new tactics. He established his capital at Sais and encouraged trade with Greek cities, allowing merchants to settle at Naucratis in the delta. This period, sometimes called the Sete Renaissance, saw a deliberate revival of older Egyptian customs. Artists copied statues and reliefs from the Old Kingdom and Middle Kingdom, scribes collected and recopied ancient texts, and temples received new decorations in traditional styles. Psamtik I and his successors ruled a relatively stable Egypt for about 150 years, but the country remained vulnerable to larger powers beyond its borders. The Persian Empire under Cambyses conquered Egypt in 525 BC, defeating the last Sate king Psamtik III at the Battle of Pelusium. The Persians treated Egypt as a satrapy, or province, and appointed governors to collect taxes and maintain order. Some Persian kings, notably Darius I, showed respect for Egyptian religion by repairing temples and supporting the priesthoods. Yet native resentment grew over time, and several revolts broke out, often with help from Greek city-states. Brief periods of independence occurred under local dynasties such as the 28th, 29th, and 30th, but these lasted only a few decades before Persian forces returned. Throughout the Third Intermediate Period and the years of foreign rule, ordinary life along the Nile continued much as it had for centuries. Farmers planted their fields after the flood, scribes kept records in the temples and administrative centres, and craftsmen produced goods for local markets and royal courts. The division of the country into northern and southern spheres meant that taxes and labour were directed to whichever authority held power in each region, but the basic systems of irrigation and grain storage remained intact. Temples served as important economic and social hubs, offering work and protection to people in times of uncertainty. The introduction of new groups, whether Libyan settlers, Kushite officials, or Greek mercenaries, added fresh elements to society without erasing the core Egyptian identity that had endured for so many generations. The repeated invasions and shifts in power reflected the changing balance of forces in the wider Mediterranean and Near Eastern world. Egypt's wealth and strategic location made it a tempting target, while internal divisions among its own elites prevented a unified defence. The river that had once supported a single strong kingdom now flowed through a land that was frequently contested by outside powers. Yet even under foreign rulers, the temples continued their rituals, the fields produced their harvests, and the people adapted to each new government while preserving their language, writing, and religious traditions. The long decline from the height of the New Kingdom had not destroyed Egyptian civilization, but had instead transformed it into a more fragmented and externally influenced society that would face even greater changes in the centuries ahead. By the time the Persians returned for a second period of rule in the 4th century BC, the stage was set for one final major conquest that would bring the era of independent ancient Egyptian rule to a close. The country that had once projected power across an empire now found itself a province within larger foreign realms, its resources directed outward, and its internal affairs shaped by distant capitals. The monuments of earlier kings still stood along the Nile, silent witnesses to a time when the two lands had been united and strong under their own pharaohs. The gradual loss of empire and the cycles of invasion during the Third Intermediate Period marked the end of one of the most enduring phases of Egyptian history. Yet the underlying rhythms of the river and the land continued to sustain the people who lived beside them. The second period of Persian rule over Egypt had settled into a pattern of provincial administration by the middle of the 4th century BC. Governors appointed from the Persian court collected taxes in grain and silver, while local Egyptian officials handled day-to-day affairs in the nomes. Temples continued to function under royal grants, and the Nile's annual flood still dictated the rhythm of planting and harvest for farmers along its banks. Yet the arrangement left many Egyptians feeling distant from their own traditions of kingship. When a new threat appeared from the west in the form of the Macedonian king Alexander, the Persians were already weakened by revolts elsewhere in their empire. In 332 BC, Alexander's army crossed from Gaza into the delta without meeting serious resistance. The Persian satrap handed over control of the country, and Alexander entered Memphis, where he performed sacrifices to the traditional gods and was crowned with the double crown in a ceremony that echoed the rituals of earlier pharaohs. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast near the western edge of the delta, naming it Alexandria after himself. The site offered a fine harbour and easy access to trade routes, and within a few years it grew into a major centre of learning and commerce that would shape the region for centuries. Alexander spent only a short time in Egypt before marching on to conquer the rest of the Persian Empire. He left a small garrison and appointed 2 trusted officers to manage civil and military affairs. After his death in 323 BC, his generals divided the conquered lands among themselves. One of them, Ptolemy, son of Lagos, took control of Egypt and soon declared himself king. Ptolemy I Soter, as he became known, established the Ptolemaic dynasty that would rule the country for nearly 300 years. He and his successors governed from Alexandria, blending Greek administrative methods with Egyptian royal customs. They kept the ancient title of pharaoh, appeared in traditional regalia on temple walls, and supported the priesthoods with land grants and building projects. At the same time, they introduced Greek as the language of court and government, founded libraries and schools that attracted scholars from across the Mediterranean, and encouraged Greek settlers to farm new land reclaimed from marshes in the Fayum. The early Ptolemies expanded the kingdom's influence through diplomacy and occasional warfare. Ptolemy II Philadelphus strengthened the navy and built the famous lighthouse on the island of Pharaohs that guided ships into Alexandria's harbour. He also sponsored expeditions south along the Red Sea and into Nubia to secure trade in ivory, gold and elephants for the army. Temples at Edfu, Dendera and Philae received major additions during this period, their walls carved with scenes showing Ptolemaic kings offering to Egyptian gods in the old style. The dynasty's wealth came from efficient tax collection, state monopolies on oil and textiles, and the export of grain that fed cities throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Alexandria itself became a cosmopolitan hub where Egyptians, Greeks, Jews and traders from farther east lived side by side. The Great Library and Museum drew philosophers, poets, and scientists who studied geometry, astronomy, and medicine. building on knowledge preserved from earlier Egyptian and Greek traditions. Later rulers faced increasing pressure from Rome, the rising power in the Mediterranean. Ptolemy XII Auletes spent much of his reign seeking Roman support to keep his throne, borrowing money and granting favours that weakened the kingdom's finances. When he died in 51 BC, his daughter Cleopatra VII and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII inherited the throne jointly. Cleopatra quickly showed herself to be a capable leader, fluent in several languages, including Egyptian, which most earlier Ptolemies had never bothered to learn. She worked to restore stability by reducing debt, supporting temple restorations, and improving irrigation in the delta. In 48 BC, the Roman general Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria during his pursuit of his rival Pompey. Cleopatra arranged a meeting with him, and the two formed a political and personal alliance. Caesar helped her defeat her brother in a brief civil war, and secured her position as sole ruler. Their son Caesarion was born the following year and later recognized as co-ruler. After Caesar's assassination in 44 BC, Cleopatra aligned with Mark Antony, one of the leaders who emerged in the Roman power struggle. Antony governed the eastern provinces of Rome, and together they planned a grand campaign against the Parthians to the east. Cleopatra supplied ships, grain, and funds, while Antony granted her additional territories in the Levant and Cyprus. Their partnership blended Roman military ambition with Ptolemaic wealth and Egyptian symbolism. In 34 BC, they staged a grand ceremony in Alexandria, known as the Donations of Alexandria, in which they distributed lands among their children and presented Cleopatra as the new Isis and Antony as a divine counterpart. These moves alarmed the Roman Senate and especially Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, who portrayed the relationship as a threat to Roman values. The conflict came to a head in 31 BC, at the naval battle of Actium off the coast of Greece. Octavian's fleet, commanded by Agrippa, outmaneuvered the larger but less coordinated forces of Antony and Cleopatra. When Cleopatra's ships withdrew from the fighting, Antony followed, and the battle turned into a rout. The couple returned to Alexandria, but their position was hopeless. Octavian advanced through Syria and reached the Egyptian border the following year. Antony's troops deserted in large numbers, and in August of 30 BC he took his own life after receiving a false report that Cleopatra had already died. Cleopatra followed soon afterward, choosing to end her life rather than be paraded through Rome as a captive. With her death, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Octavian, who later took the name Augustus, annexed Egypt as a personal province of the Roman emperor. He visited Alexandria and Memphis, paid respects at the tomb of Alexander, and ordered that Caesarion be put to death to remove any rival claim. Roman rule brought changes to the way the country was governed. Egypt became the emperor's private estate, its grain supply vital for feeding the population of Rome itself. Prefects appointed directly by the emperor oversaw administration, and a stricter tax system was imposed that included regular censuses and land surveys. The old temple priesthoods continued to operate but with less independence, and new Roman-style towns appeared alongside the ancient villages. Alexandria retained its status as a centre of learning, but the focus of power now lay far across the sea in Rome. Over the following centuries, Christianity spread along the Nile, gradually replacing the older gods, while the Egyptian language evolved into Coptic and was written in a new script. Yet the basic patterns of farming, irrigation, and daily life remained rooted in the land and the river that had sustained the country for more than 3,000 years. The arrival of Alexander, the rise of the Ptolemies, and the final years under Cleopatra marked the closing chapter of independent ancient Egyptian rule. The kingdom that had once unified under Narmer and reached its greatest extent under Thutmose III now became part of a larger Mediterranean world, dominated first by Greeks and then by Romans. Each foreign dynasty had adapted to Egyptian traditions while introducing new ideas, technologies, and languages. Temples built by the Ptolemies still stand today, their walls showing kings in pharaonic dress performing the same offerings that had been made since the earliest dynasties. The city of Alexandria, with its library and lighthouse, symbolized the blend of cultures that defined the final centuries. Cleopatra's intelligence and political skill allowed Egypt to maintain a measure of autonomy longer than it might have otherwise, but the tide of Roman power proved unstoppable. Even after the loss of independence, the Nile continued to shape the lives of its people. Farmers planted and harvested according to the flood, scribes kept records for new masters, and artisans produced goods that reflected both old and new influences. The monuments along the river from Giza to Philae stood as reminders of earlier greatness, visited by Greek and Roman travellers who marvelled at the pyramids and temples. The story of ancient Egypt did not vanish with Cleopatra. It simply passed into a new phase where its legacy would be studied and preserved by later generations. The land that had given rise to one of the world's longest-lasting civilizations now contributed its knowledge, art, and administrative experience to the empires that followed. In the quiet villages beside the river, the annual cycle of flood, planting, and harvest went on unchanged. Families repaired their mud brick houses, tended their fields, and gathered for local festivals that still honoured the old rhythms even as new beliefs appeared. The river that had witnessed unification, pyramid building, empire, and decline continued to flow northward toward the sea, carrying with it the memory of countless generations who had lived along its banks. The final chapters of ancient Egyptian rule had ended, yet the civilization they represented had left an imprint on history that would endure far beyond the arrival of Alexander or the conquest by Rome. The story of ancient Egypt has now come to its close, a long journey that began with the quiet gift of the Nile and unfolded through centuries of unity, achievement, challenge, and change. As the river flows on, steady and unchanging, it reminds us that even the greatest civilizations rise and fall within the larger rhythms of time and nature. Take a slow breath now, feel the soft weight of the covers, and let the fan's gentle hum blend with the quiet darkness around you. The lights are low, the world outside is still, and you have travelled far through the ages tonight. Sleep well, and let the gentle current of the past carry you into peaceful dreams.